In the depths of underground bunkers across 6 continents, red lights blink silently on control panels that could unleash humanity's final chapter. Behind reinforced steel doors, decision-makers hold keys to weapons so powerful they could end civilization in minutes. Yet tonight, as you sleep peacefully in your bed, the world stands closer to the precipice of global annihilation than at any moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The clock is ticking, and midnight approaches faster than anyone dares to imagine. The clock strikes midnight, deep beneath the Colorado mountains. Inside the legendary Cheyenne Mountain Complex, screens flicker with data streams that would chill the blood of any observer. Here, in chambers carved from solid granite and protected by blast doors weighing 25 tons each, military analysts monitor what intelligence officials privately call the most dangerous global security environment in human history. The facility, built to withstand a direct nuclear strike, now tracks threats that would have seemed impossible during the Cold War when these tunnels were first excavated. Unlike the singular standoff between 2 superpowers that defined the 20th century, today's world writhes under the weight of 6 simultaneous crises, each involving nuclear-armed nations, each capable of igniting World War III within hours rather than months. The mathematics of survival have changed dramatically. Where once humanity faced a single point of potential failure, we now navigate a minefield of interconnected triggers, any one of which could cascade into global catastrophe. Nuclear arms race to intensify amid control crisis, says SIPRI. These words, published by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, represent more than academic analysis. They constitute a death certificate for the era of nuclear reductions that began with the end of the Cold War. For the first time in decades, the global nuclear arsenal is expanding rather than shrinking, with 12,241 warheads worldwide and 3,912 deployed on missiles and aircraft, ready for immediate use. What makes this moment uniquely perilous is not merely the number of weapons, but their revolutionary capabilities. China's nuclear arsenal has expanded by approximately 100 warheads annually, while all 9 nuclear-armed states are modernizing their arsenals with new delivery systems. These are not the lumbering ICBMs of the Cold War, but hypersonic weapons that travel at Mach 27 speeds, compressing the decision-making window from 30 minutes to mere moments. The underground chambers of Cheyenne Mountain have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, but never have they monitored a world where artificial intelligence systems could trigger nuclear responses faster than human commanders could intervene. The integration of AI into early warning systems, while designed to enhance security, has created unprecedented vulnerabilities where software errors or cyber attacks could initiate sequences leading to global annihilation. Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine transformed theoretical nuclear scenarios into daily realities, with NATO weapon systems engaging Russian forces directly, while Putin's modified nuclear doctrine explicitly threatens atomic response to conventional attacks by nuclear allies. Every Ukrainian strike on Russian territory using Western-supplied weapons represents a potential Article 5 trigger that could drag 31 NATO nations into direct confrontation with the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Yet Ukraine represents only one flashpoint among 6. China's directive for the People's Liberation Army to be ready for Taiwan invasion by 2027 coincides with North Korea's completion of its 5-year military development plan and constitutional mandate for exponential nuclear warhead production. The convergence is not coincidental. It represents calculated timing by authoritarian powers who perceive a window of opportunity created by democratic divisions and technological advantages. The very technologies that connect our modern world have become weapons of unprecedented destruction. Hypersonic weapons development by Russia, China, and the United States has created delivery systems that can strike anywhere on Earth within minutes while remaining undetectable until impact. Russia claims operational deployment of the Avangard system capable of speeds that render traditional missile defense systems obsolete, while China's DFZF program and America's delayed Dark Eagle represent a new category of weapons that essentially eliminate the decision-making window that prevented nuclear war during previous crises. Cyber warfare capabilities now allow state actors to conduct attacks that were previously impossible while maintaining plausible deniability. China's Salt Typhoon Group has infiltrated American telecommunications infrastructure, accessing wiretap systems and gaining the ability to monitor sensitive communications. Russia conducts 2.4 million daily cyber attacks on Taiwan alone, testing defenses while gathering intelligence for potential invasion scenarios. The expansion of warfare into space represents perhaps the most ominous development. For nations now possess demonstrated anti-satellite weapons capabilities, with Russia reportedly developing nuclear-powered ASAT systems that could violate the Outer Space Treaty. The targeting of early warning satellites essential for nuclear deterrence creates strategic instability by eliminating the detection capabilities required for measured responses to potential threats. But perhaps most terrifying of all is how individual psychology under extreme pressure determines humanity's survival. Historical analysis reveals that nuclear war has been prevented not by institutional safeguards or wise leadership, but by the personal judgment of unknown individuals making split-second decisions under conditions that eliminate rational deliberation. The Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1983 false alarm, the 1995 Norwegian rocket incident, each brought humanity within minutes of nuclear warfare, saved only by individual officers who trusted intuition over protocol. Today's compressed decision-making timelines, created by hypersonic weapons and automated systems, may eliminate even these last-second opportunities for human intervention. NATO's Article 5 collective defense commitment faces unprecedented testing as multiple alliance members confront direct threats while decision-making procedures prove inadequate for rapid escalation scenarios. The mathematics are stark and unforgiving. If each of 6 major flashpoints has a 95% probability of peaceful resolution in any given year, an optimistic assessment given current tensions, the combined probability of avoiding all conflicts is only 74%. This calculation assumes independence between crises that are actually interconnected through alliance systems, economic relationships, and strategic competition that could cause regional conflicts to cascade into global warfare within hours. In the depths of Cheyenne Mountain, as analysts monitor data streams from around the world, they understand what the public does not. We are no longer living in peacetime, but in the preliminary stages of a conflict that could escalate beyond all historical precedent. The question is not whether World War III could happen, but whether humanity possesses the wisdom and institutions necessary to prevent it when the margin for error has never been smaller and the consequences of failure have never been more absolute. The clock strikes midnight in more places than we know, and dawn may never come again. Arsenal of the Apocalypse. As the midnight hour approaches in those buried command centers, the screens reveal a truth more terrifying than any horror humanity has ever conceived. The instruments of our potential destruction have evolved far beyond the crude weapons that once held the world hostage during the Cold War. Deep within fortified silos across the globe, in the belly of nuclear submarines prowling beneath Arctic ice, and mounted on mobile launchers that roam the vast expanses of Mongolia and Siberia, lies an arsenal so advanced, so utterly devastating, that its mere existence represents humanity's greatest gamble with extinction. The numbers alone tell a story of unprecedented peril. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's latest assessment, 12,241 nuclear warheads exist worldwide as of 2025, with 3,912 deployed on missiles, aircraft, and submarines, ready to launch within minutes of receiving authorization codes. But these are not the aging relics of a bygone era. These are weapons of the 21st century, engineered with precision that would astound their Cold War predecessors, each one capable of unleashing destruction that dwarfs the bombs that obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the global nuclear stockpile is growing rather than shrinking. The era of arms reduction treaties and peaceful dismantlement has ended, replaced by what experts grimly call the new nuclear arms race. China's arsenal expands by approximately 100 warheads annually, transforming what was once a minimal deterrent into a force capable of global destruction. Intelligence estimates suggest China's nuclear forces could rival those of the United States and Russia within the decade, creating not a bipolar nuclear standoff, but a triangular balance of terror where any miscalculation could trigger responses from multiple directions. Russia maintains the world's largest nuclear arsenal with an estimated 5,977 warheads, including tactical weapons designed for battlefield use. These smaller nuclear devices, with yields ranging from 1 to 100 kilotons, represent a particularly insidious threat because they blur the line between conventional and nuclear warfare. Russian doctrine increasingly treats these weapons as usable in regional conflicts, a dramatic departure from Cold War strategies that reserved nuclear weapons for existential threats to the homeland. Yet the most chilling development lies not in the quantity of weapons, but in their revolutionary capabilities. Hidden within the depths of Russian military facilities, engineers have perfected what they claim is the ultimate weapon, the Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle. This system, Putin boasts, can travel at speeds exceeding Mach 27, nearly 21,000 miles per hour. At such velocities, the weapon appears on radar screens for mere seconds before impact, essentially eliminating the warning time that has prevented nuclear war for decades. Traditional ballistic missiles follow predictable parabolic arcs, allowing defenders approximately 30 minutes to detect, track, and potentially intercept incoming threats. This half-hour window, though brief, has proven crucial in preventing accidental nuclear war. It provides time for human verification of threats, communication between adversaries, and diplomatic intervention before the point of no return. Hypersonic weapons destroy this margin of safety, compressing decision-making windows to minutes or even seconds. China's hypersonic program has achieved similar breakthroughs with the DFZF system, conducted over 9 successful tests, and believed to be operational since 2020. The weapon's ability to maneuver unpredictably during flight makes it nearly impossible to intercept with current missile defense systems. American intelligence officials describe Chinese hypersonic capabilities as a potential game-changer that could neutralize decades of investment in ballistic missile defense systems. The United States, despite its massive defense budget, finds itself playing catch-up in hypersonic development. The Dark Eagle program has suffered repeated delays, with initial operational capability pushed back to 2025 at the earliest. This technological gap has created what defense analysts call hypersonic anxiety, the fear that America's nuclear deterrent could become vulnerable to first strikes that arrive too quickly for effective response. But hypersonic weapons represent only one facet of modern nuclear warfare's evolution. Deep beneath the Arctic ice, Russian submarines prowl the ocean depths carrying Poseidon nuclear-powered torpedoes, weapons so devastating they defy comprehension. Each Poseidon carries a nuclear warhead estimated at 2 megatons, designed to create radioactive tsunamis that could render entire coastlines uninhabitable for decades. The weapon's nuclear propulsion gives it virtually unlimited range, allowing it to lurk undetected in international waters before striking coastal cities thousands of miles from its launch point. North Korea's nuclear program has achieved capabilities that would have seemed impossible 2 decades ago. From 0 nuclear weapons in 2003, the regime now possesses an estimated 50 warheads with sufficient fissile material to produce 40 more. The progression from crude, stationary devices to mobile, solid-fuel missiles capable of reaching the continental United States represents one of the most rapid nuclear developments in history. Kim Jong-un's 2025 constitutional mandate for exponential nuclear warhead production signals that this expansion is far from complete. Perhaps most troubling is North Korea's development of tactical nuclear weapons designed for battlefield use. Unlike strategic weapons intended to deter attacks on the homeland, tactical nuclear weapons blur the line between conventional and nuclear warfare. Their smaller yields and battlefield applications make their use more likely during conventional conflicts, creating escalation pathways that could quickly spiral into global nuclear war. Pakistan's nuclear arsenal has grown to an estimated 170 warheads, including tactical weapons designed to offset India's conventional military superiority. Pakistan's full-spectrum deterrence doctrine explicitly threatens nuclear weapon use against Indian conventional attacks, creating hair-trigger scenarios where border skirmishes could escalate to nuclear exchange within hours. The May 2025 India-Pakistan crisis demonstrated how quickly these weapons could move from theoretical deterrence to active threats during multi-domain warfare. India's nuclear modernization includes the development of submarine-launched ballistic missiles and intermediate-range systems designed to counter Chinese expansion. India's review of its no-first-use policy amid ongoing border tensions with both Pakistan and China suggests a potential shift toward more aggressive nuclear postures that could destabilize the entire region. Israel's undeclared nuclear program, estimated at 80 to 90 warheads, has taken on new significance amid direct warfare with Iran. Israeli capabilities include both gravity bombs and missile-delivered systems designed to penetrate deeply buried targets. precisely the type of weapons needed to destroy Iran's underground nuclear facilities. The June 2025 Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites demonstrated the regime's willingness to risk nuclear escalation to prevent Persian atomic weapons development. Iran's nuclear program remains weeks away from producing weapons-grade uranium, according to International Atomic Energy Agency assessments, though weaponization would require additional time. Iran's development of increasingly sophisticated ballistic missiles, including systems capable of reaching Israeli territory, creates a timeline pressure where preventive military action becomes more likely as capabilities approach completion. But the most revolutionary development involves artificial intelligence integration into nuclear command and control systems. All major nuclear powers now employ AI for threat detection, target identification, and response recommendations. While humans theoretically retain launch authority, the compression of decision-making timelines created by hypersonic weapons may effectively delegate life-or-death choices to algorithmic systems operating at superhuman speeds. The combination of these technologies creates unprecedented instability in nuclear deterrence relationships. Traditional deterrence theory assumed rational actors operating with sufficient time to assess threats and formulate responses. Modern weapons eliminate this time buffer, while AI systems introduce algorithmic decision-making whose logic may prove incompatible with human survival instincts. Cyber warfare capabilities now threaten the communication systems essential for nuclear command and control. Chinese infiltration of American telecommunications infrastructure through operations like Salt Typhoon demonstrates how adversaries could potentially disrupt the communications needed for nuclear crisis management. The targeting of satellites providing early warning and communication services represents another vulnerability that could leave nuclear-armed states blind and deaf during critical moments. The arsenal of the apocalypse extends beyond nuclear weapons to encompass cyber, space, and conventional precision systems that could cripple modern societies without detonating a single nuclear device. The interconnected nature of these systems means that conflicts could begin in cyberspace or outer space before escalating to nuclear warfare through pathways that existing treaties and institutions were never designed to address. As dawn breaks over the missile fields of Montana, the submarine bases of Murmansk, and the underground complexes of China's northwestern provinces, the guardians of these ultimate weapons begin another day of vigilance. They know, as the public does not, that the weapons under their care have evolved beyond the crude devices that once held the world in balance. Today's arsenal possesses capabilities that compress time, eliminate options, and create cascading failures that could transform regional disputes into species-ending catastrophes within hours. The apocalypse, it seems, has been technologically optimized for efficiency. 6 gates to hell. In the shadowed halls of the Pentagon, intelligence analysts have identified what they privately call the 6 gates, flashpoints scattered across the globe, where the apocalyptic arsenal we have just witnessed waits poised for deployment. Each gate represents a threshold that, once crossed, could unleash cascading destruction across continents within hours. Unlike the singular Berlin crisis or Cuban confrontation that defined Cold War tensions, these 6 gates operate simultaneously, their fates intertwined by alliance systems, economic dependencies, and strategic calculations that transform local conflicts into global catastrophes. Tonight, as the world sleeps, each gate trembles on the edge of opening, and behind each door lies a pathway to the end of everything we know. The Eastern Gate, Ukraine's Article 5 precipice. Deep in the frozen trenches of eastern Ukraine, where the earth has been churned into a moonscape by 3 years of relentless warfare, the first gate stands perpetually ajar. Here, NATO weapons systems engage Russian forces in direct combat while Moscow's nuclear doctrine explicitly threatens atomic response to conventional attacks by nuclear allies. Every Ukrainian strike on Russian territory using Western-supplied weapons represents a potential Article 5 trigger that could drag 31 NATO nations into direct confrontation with the world's largest nuclear arsenal. The mathematics of escalation grow more terrifying with each passing day. Russia now occupies 20% of Ukrainian territory after gaining 4,000 square kilometers in 2024 alone, while Putin's modified nuclear doctrine of November 2024 treats conventional attacks by nuclear allies as grounds for nuclear retaliation. This represents a fundamental lowering of the nuclear threshold, transforming every Ukrainian operation using NATO weapons into a potential spark for global conflagration. Intelligence assessments reveal that Russian forces have moved tactical nuclear weapons to forward positions near the Ukrainian border, weapons with yields ranging from 1 to 100 kilotons, designed specifically for battlefield use. These are not the city-destroying strategic weapons of Cold War nightmares, but usable nuclear devices that Russian doctrine increasingly treats as viable options in regional conflicts. The Trump administration's strained relations with NATO allies over Ukraine support have created dangerous uncertainty about collective defense commitments. This ambiguity could encourage Russian testing of Article 5 while simultaneously making American responses less predictable and potentially more extreme. When adversaries cannot calculate responses with confidence, they may gamble on actions that inadvertently trigger the very wars they sought to avoid. The Pacific Gate, Taiwan's 2027 timeline, 8,000 miles across the Pacific, beneath the surface of the Taiwan Strait, Chinese submarines patrol waters that may soon become the epicenter of World War III. U.S. officials have confirmed Xi Jinping's directive for the People's Liberation Army to be ready for Taiwan invasion by 2027, creating what Foreign Affairs Analysis describes as a 35% probability of all-out invasion and 60% probability of limited conflict or blockade within this critical window. Chinese military activity near Taiwan increased 300% in 2024, with the PLA conducting its largest naval deployment since the 1996 crisis. These are not mere exercises, warns Admiral Samuel Papineau. The PLA's aggressive operations around Taiwan are not just exercises. They are rehearsals. Every mock amphibious assault, every simulated blockade, every practice run at overwhelming Taiwan's air defenses represents preparation for an operation that would immediately involve American forces under long-standing security commitments. The Pentagon's war games consistently predict that a Taiwan conflict would escalate to nuclear threats within days of commencement. China's expanding nuclear arsenal, now growing by 100 warheads annually, provides Beijing with escalation options unavailable during previous Taiwan crises. The 2025 to 2027 window represents what Chinese strategists perceive as optimal conditions. American political distraction, NATO focus on Ukraine, and Chinese military capabilities reaching peak readiness for what they call the final resolution of the Taiwan question. Taiwan's production of 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors transforms this island into perhaps the most valuable military target in human history. A Chinese invasion would not merely represent territorial conquest, but control over the technological foundation of modern warfare itself. The economic shock waves alone could collapse global supply chains within weeks, creating conditions where adversaries might calculate that further escalation poses acceptable risks compared to economic strangulation. The Middle Eastern Gate, Israel-Iran's nuclear countdown. In the scorching deserts between Jerusalem and Tehran, the third gate has already begun to creak open. The June 2025 direct warfare between Israel and Iran shattered decades of proxy conflict, with Israel's Operation Rising Lion targeting Iranian nuclear facilities, while Iran launched over 100 drones and ballistic missiles at Israeli territory. Though a fragile ceasefire currently holds, both nations prepare for resumption of hostilities that could draw the United States into direct conflict with Iran, while Israel contemplates preemptive nuclear strikes. Iran's nuclear program remains weeks away from weapons-grade uranium production, according to International Atomic Energy Agency assessments, creating timeline pressures that make military action increasingly likely. Israeli capabilities include bunker-busting weapons specifically designed to penetrate deeply buried nuclear facilities, precisely the type of attack that could prompt Iranian retaliation against American bases across the region. The Trump administration's subsequent strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities following the June escalation demonstrated how rapidly Middle Eastern conflicts draw in global superpowers. Iran's declaration that Israel started this, but we will finish it, represents more than rhetorical posturing. It signals preparation for sustained warfare that could engulf the entire region while threatening global energy supplies through Strait of Hormuz closure. Israeli military doctrine includes nuclear weapons use scenarios for existential threats to the state, while Iran's development of increasingly sophisticated ballistic missiles creates delivery capabilities that would reach Israeli territory within minutes of launch. The compression of decision-making time combined with mutual escalation doctrines creates hair-trigger scenarios where individual military commanders could initiate sequences leading to regional nuclear warfare. The Northern Gate, Pyongyang's nuclear constitution. On the Korean peninsula, where the armistice of 1953 never became a peace treaty, the fourth gate trembles under pressures that have reached constitutional levels. North Korea's completion of its 5-year military development plan in 2025 coincides with Kim Jong-un's constitutional mandate to exponentially increase nuclear warhead production, transforming nuclear weapons from deterrent tools into fundamental expressions of state identity. The regime's estimated 50 nuclear warheads with sufficient fissile material for 40 more represents rapid expansion from 0 weapons in 2003. More troubling still is North Korea's successful development of tactical nuclear weapons designed for battlefield use, including underwater nuclear weapon systems that could devastate South Korean ports and American military bases within minutes of deployment. South Korea's consideration of independent nuclear deterrent development in response to northern threats could trigger Chinese or North Korean preemptive action to prevent further proliferation. The strategic calculus becomes particularly dangerous when multiple nuclear-armed states perceive use or lose scenarios where delay in action could result in adversary nuclear advantages. American troops stationed in South Korea represent automatic escalation triggers where North Korean attacks would immediately involve U.S. forces in combat operations. The 28,500 American service members deployed across South Korean bases constitute both deterrent assets and escalation mechanisms that could transform Korean peninsula conflicts into global warfare within hours of commencement. The subcontinental gate, the nuclear subcontinent's powder keg. Along the line of control that separates Indian and Pakistani forces in Kashmir, the fifth gate witnessed its most dangerous opening in May 2025 during the first multi-domain warfare between nuclear powers in human history. 10 days of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, drones, and cyber operations required direct U.S. intervention to prevent escalation to nuclear exchange, demonstrating how quickly South Asian tensions could spiral beyond regional containment. Pakistan's full-spectrum deterrence doctrine includes tactical nuclear weapons specifically designed to offset India's conventional military superiority, creating battlefield scenarios where local commanders could authorize nuclear weapon use without strategic consultation. These weapons blur the line between conventional and nuclear warfare, making their deployment more likely during border conflicts that historically remained below nuclear thresholds. India's review of its no-first-use policy amid ongoing tensions with both Pakistan and China suggests potential shifts toward more aggressive nuclear postures. The convergence of Sino-Indian border disputes with Indo-Pakistani tensions creates triangular nuclear dynamics where conflicts involving any two powers could draw in the third, potentially creating the first three-way nuclear confrontation in history. Intelligence assessments indicate both nations maintain launch-on-warning postures during high-tension periods, compressing decision-making timelines to minutes while relying on early warning systems vulnerable to technical failures or cyber attacks. A full-blown war between India and Pakistan would represent the first nuclear exchange between atomic-armed powers, creating precedents that could normalize nuclear weapon use in regional conflicts worldwide. The Maritime Gate, South China Sea's collision course. In the disputed waters of the South China Sea, where artificial islands rise from contested reefs and military vessels of multiple nations patrol in dangerous proximity, the Sixth Gate approaches its most perilous moment. The June 17, 2024 incident where Chinese Coast Guard vessels rammed Philippine Navy boats, resulting in a Filipino sailor losing his thumb, represents the type of escalation that could invoke American military response under mutual defense treaty obligations. Philippine President Marcos's warning that death of a Filipino citizen would be very, very close to an act of war creates automatic escalation triggers where Chinese maritime aggression could invoke American military intervention. The U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty's coverage of Philippine forces anywhere in the South China Sea means that Chinese attacks on Philippine vessels could trigger Article 5 equivalent responses from American forces within hours. China's control over critical shipping lanes carrying 21% of global maritime trade transforms South China Sea conflicts into threats to global economic stability. The geographic concentration of shipping routes through these disputed waters means that blockades or military action could cripple international commerce while creating conditions where multiple nations perceive vital interests at stake. The mathematical probability that all six gates remain closed simultaneously diminishes with each passing day. Intelligence analysts understand what public officials rarely acknowledge: These are not separate crises, but interconnected elements of a global system approaching catastrophic failure. The opening of any single gate could trigger responses that force open the others, creating cascading escalation that transforms regional disputes into species-threatening global warfare. Behind each gate, nuclear weapons wait in their silos, submarines, and mobile launchers. The question is no longer whether one will open, but which will be first, and whether humanity possesses the wisdom to close them again before darkness falls forever. Echoes from the brink. As we contemplate these 6 gates that could unleash global annihilation, a haunting truth emerges from the classified archives of intelligence agencies across the world. Humanity has stood at this precipice before, and our survival has depended not on the wisdom of institutions or the brilliance of leaders, but on the split-second decisions of unknown individuals whose names history barely remembers. Deep within the vaults of the National Security Archive, in the basement archives of the Kremlin, and scattered through the classified files of nuclear-armed nations, lie the testimonies of ordinary people who held the fate of civilization in their hands for mere moments and chose life over death when everything around them screamed for war. These echoes from the brink carry urgent warnings for our current moment, revealing patterns of crisis escalation that repeat across decades like some terrible cosmic rhythm. They show us that nuclear war has been prevented not by elaborate treaties or sophisticated early warning systems, but by individual human beings who trusted their instincts over their orders, their humanity over their training, their conscience over their computers. As today's 6 gates tremble on the edge of opening, these historical near-misses illuminate both our greatest vulnerabilities and our last, best hope for survival. The Cuban Crucible, one man's refusal. October 27, 1962. Somewhere beneath the tropical waters of the Caribbean, in the suffocating hull of Soviet submarine B-59, the temperature has risen to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels approach lethal concentrations. Crew members collapse from heat exhaustion and chemical poisoning. For hours, no communication has reached them from Moscow, and the submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, believes that nuclear war has already begun above the surface of the sea. In the submarine's torpedo room lies a weapon that would change the course of human history, a nuclear torpedo with the explosive yield of the Hiroshima bomb. According to Soviet naval protocol, 3 officers must agree to authorize its use: the captain, the political officer, and the deputy commander. Captain Savitsky, convinced that his homeland is under attack, orders the weapon prepared for launch against the American destroyer USS Randolph. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov concurs immediately. The fate of the world now rests with one man, Deputy Commander Vasily Arkhipov. What happens next in that hellish, overheated chamber defies every principle of military discipline and nuclear doctrine. Arkhipov, despite the unanimous judgment of his fellow officers, despite the apparent evidence of war raging above, despite the unbearable pressure of command responsibility, refuses to authorize the launch. His decision violates direct orders from a superior officer, contradicts apparent tactical necessity, and risks court-martial or execution upon return to port. History would later reveal that no war had begun, that the depth charges dropped by American destroyers were warning shots designed to force the submarine to surface, that nuclear Armageddon had been averted by the quiet refusal of an unknown Soviet naval officer whose name the world would not learn for decades. Arkhipov's decision represents perhaps the most important moment in human history, a single individual's choice between orders and instinct, between protocol and preservation, between military duty and species survival. The false dawn of 1983, a funny feeling in the gut. 21 years later, in the pre-dawn darkness of September 26, 1983, another unknown individual faced the same terrible choice in the underground bunkers of Serpukhov 15, a secret Soviet installation south of Moscow. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, a software engineer turned nuclear early warning officer, watched in horror as computer screens displayed the unmistakable signature of incoming American intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Oko satellite system, the Soviet Union's most advanced early warning technology, reported first 1 missile, then 5, then dozens launched from American bases and hurtling toward Soviet territory. Every protocol demanded immediate response. Soviet nuclear doctrine called for launch-on-warning retaliation to prevent American first strike advantage. The countdown clocks began their inexorable march toward 0 hour. Petrov's duty was clear: report the attack immediately to Soviet leadership, triggering automatic nuclear response that would obliterate American cities within 30 minutes. Instead, Petrov hesitated. Something felt wrong about the attack signature: too few missiles for a genuine first strike, too obvious for a surprise attack, too perfectly timed during a period of maximum tension. Despite the screaming alarms, despite the computer confirmations, despite the overwhelming evidence displayed on every screen around him, Petrov trusted what he later called a funny feeling in my gut. His decision to report the alarm as a false positive rather than genuine attack violated every aspect of his training and responsibility. Had he been wrong, the Soviet Union would have been destroyed without retaliation, and Petrov would bear personal responsibility for national annihilation. But he was right. The missile signatures were sunlight reflecting off clouds, interpreted by satellite sensors as rocket exhaust. His refusal to report the attack as genuine prevented nuclear war that would have killed hundreds of millions within hours. The timing makes Petrov's decision even more extraordinary. The false alarm occurred during NATO's Able Archer 83 exercise, the most realistic nuclear war simulation ever conducted by Western forces. Soviet intelligence agencies had convinced themselves that the exercise might serve as cover for actual first strike, leading to Soviet nuclear forces being placed on high alert and combat aircraft being loaded with nuclear weapons. In this atmosphere of maximum paranoia and minimum trust, one man's intuition prevented the end of human civilization. The Norwegian rocket minutes from midnight. Even after the Cold War's supposed end, the echoes of near catastrophe continued to reverberate through the halls of power. On January 25, 1995, President Boris Yeltsin became the first leader in history to activate his nuclear briefcase, the communications device that would authorize Russian nuclear launch in response to what appeared to be an incoming submarine-launched ballistic missile aimed at Moscow. The threat was real enough. Radar operators detected a rocket ascending rapidly from Norwegian territory, following the exact trajectory that an American Trident missile would take if launched from a submarine in the Barents Sea. The flight profile matched intelligence assessments of how the United States might conduct a decapitation strike against Russian leadership, using submarine-launched missiles to eliminate command and control before a general nuclear attack. For 8 terrifying minutes, the Russian nuclear command system activated at the highest level. Strategic forces received preliminary launch orders. Mobile missile units prepared for immediate retaliation. The nuclear briefcase, containing the codes and communications necessary to authorize Russian nuclear response, hummed to life in Yeltsin's hands for the first and only time in post-Soviet history. The rocket was, in fact, a scientific instrument launched to study the aurora borealis, a routine atmospheric research mission that had been reported to Russian authorities through diplomatic channels months earlier. But in the chaos of post-Soviet governmental transition, the notification had been lost, creating conditions where peaceful scientific research nearly triggered global nuclear war. Yeltsin's restraint during those 8 minutes represents another moment when individual judgment prevented species extinction. Unlike the elaborate decision-making processes that democratic theory assumes, nuclear crisis response depends on the psychology, intuition, and moral courage of individual leaders operating under conditions of extreme stress and compressed timelines. The patterns that repeat. These historical near-misses reveal disturbing patterns that apply directly to today's 6 gates of potential catastrophe. First, nuclear crises develop far more rapidly than institutional response mechanisms can accommodate. The Cuban Missile Submarine situation unfolded in hours, the 1983 false alarm required decision within minutes, and the Norwegian rocket incident compressed choice into an 8-minute window. Today's hypersonic weapons and automated systems compress these timelines even further, potentially eliminating human judgment entirely. Second, the individuals who prevent nuclear war are never the ones institutional planning assumes will make such decisions. Arkhipov was a deputy commander, not a captain. Petrov was a software engineer, not a strategic planner. Neither occupied positions of ultimate authority, yet their personal choices determined humanity's survival. Current nuclear command structures may not provide similar opportunities for individual intervention when artificial intelligence systems and automated responses dominate decision-making processes. Third, accurate information becomes almost impossible to obtain during genuine crises. B-59's crew had no communication with Moscow. Petrov's computers showed convincing evidence of attack. Yeltsin's radar operators tracked what appeared to be incoming missiles. In each case, the information available to decision-makers pointed toward war, while the reality was peaceful or accidental. Today's information warfare capabilities, cyber attack possibilities, and electronic interference create even greater opportunities for misperception during crises. Fourth, the psychological pressures of nuclear decision-making eliminate the rational deliberation that deterrence theory requires. Heat exhaustion and carbon dioxide poisoning affected B-59's crew. Time pressure forced Petrov to trust intuition over data. Yeltsin faced 8 minutes to decide humanity's fate. Modern leaders may face even shorter timelines while confronting the same psychological pressures that cloud judgment during extreme stress. Most ominously, each historical near-miss occurred during periods when only 2 nuclear superpowers faced direct confrontation. Today's world features 9 nuclear-armed states with varying command structures, decision-making processes, and crisis management capabilities. The mathematical probability of preventing escalation across multiple simultaneous confrontations approaches zero when historical success rates were achieved through individual heroism rather than institutional effectiveness. The echoes from the brink carry clear warnings. Nuclear war prevention depends on individual human beings making correct choices under impossible conditions, with inadequate information, within compressed timelines, while experiencing extreme psychological pressure. The technological developments that define today's threats, hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, automated response systems, may eliminate the human intervention opportunities that saved humanity during previous crises. As dawn breaks over a world where 6 gates could open simultaneously, these historical lessons provide both hope and terror. Hope that individual courage can triumph over institutional failure. Terror that we may be creating systems where such courage cannot operate quickly enough to save us all. The echoes grow fainter with each passing year, but their warnings grow more urgent. We are running out of time to learn from the past before the future overtakes us entirely. Weapons of tomorrow's war. The echoes of those brave individuals who saved humanity fade into silence as we enter an age where their heroic interventions may no longer be possible. In the sterile laboratories of defense contractors across 3 continents, in the server farms that hum beneath Silicon Valley, and within the classified research facilities hidden beneath the Nevada desert, a new generation of weapons emerges, weapons that think, decide, and kill without human oversight. These are not the crude missiles and torpedoes that Arkhipov refused to launch, nor the mechanical systems that Petrov chose not to trust. These are weapons of pure intellect, operating at the speed of light across domains that previous generations never imagined as battlefields, eliminating the precious seconds and minutes that once allowed human conscience to intervene between crisis and catastrophe. The rise of autonomous death. Deep within the Pentagon's most classified programs, the Replicator Initiative represents humanity's Faustian bargain with artificial intelligence. By 2025, the United States military plans to deploy multiple thousands of autonomous weapons systems, machines capable of identifying, tracking, and eliminating targets without human authorization. These are not remote-controlled drones operated by pilots in comfortable command centers, but truly independent killing machines that make life-and-death decisions using algorithms rather than conscience. Ukraine's battlefield has become the testing ground for this autonomous future. Over 2 million drones now operate in the conflict zone, with Ukrainian forces purchasing 10,000 AI-enhanced systems designed to function when GPS jamming eliminates human control. These machines use computer vision systems to identify targets, process friend or foe determinations in milliseconds, and execute attacks faster than human reflexes can intervene. The transition from human control to autonomous warfare is not theoretical, it is happening now, in real time, as desperate military commanders discover that survival requires surrendering human judgment to algorithmic superiority. Israeli defense systems have pioneered what military planners call algorithmic warfare through the Lavender AI targeting system operational in Gaza. This system processes visual data from thousands of surveillance sources, identifies 64 different types of military targets, and generates kill lists faster than human intelligence analysts could review individual cases. Computer vision algorithms resistant to GPS jamming guide precision strikes while machine learning systems adapt to enemy countermeasures in real time, creating an evolutionary arms race between competing artificial intelligences. the implications for nuclear warfare are terrifying. Russia's Lancet loitering munitions, China's expanding autonomous arsenal, and America's developing swarm systems represent only the beginning of a transformation that could eliminate human decision-making from the most consequential choices in history. When Vasily Arkhipov refused to launch his nuclear torpedo, he had time to think, to question, to choose conscience over orders. Future weapons may make such choices in nanoseconds, using logic trees programmed by engineers who never imagined their code would determine humanity's survival. The invisible war, cyber dominance. While autonomous weapons reshape physical battlefields, an invisible war rages through the fiber optic cables and wireless networks that connect our civilization. This conflict operates not according to traditional military logic, but through the alien mathematics of computer code, where a single programmer in Beijing or Moscow can inflict damage that previously required armored divisions to achieve. The most terrifying aspect of cyber warfare is its perfect deniability. Attacks that cripple entire nations can be executed by individuals whose existence governments will never acknowledge, creating conditions where retaliation becomes impossible to calibrate or direct. China's Salt Typhoon operation represents the apex of peacetime cyber penetration, having infiltrated American telecommunications infrastructure so thoroughly that Chinese intelligence services now possess access to wiretap systems used by U.S. law enforcement. This is not mere espionage, but preparation for warfare that could begin with the flip of a digital switch, isolating American military commanders from their forces while Chinese systems coordinate attacks at superhuman speeds. The scope of Chinese cyber operations defies comprehension. Intelligence assessments indicate 2.4 million daily cyber attacks on Taiwan alone, testing defenses while mapping critical infrastructure that could be disabled during invasion scenarios. Each probing attack gathers data about response times, system vulnerabilities, and defensive capabilities, creating detailed blueprints for infrastructure warfare that could paralyze Taiwan before the first Chinese soldier sets foot on the island. Russia's cyber warfare capabilities have evolved beyond infrastructure attacks into weapons that blur the line between digital and physical destruction. The use of riot control agents delivered through cyber-controlled systems demonstrates how traditional categories of warfare dissolve in the digital age. When computer networks can trigger chemical releases, when power grid failures can cause nuclear reactor emergencies, when traffic control systems can create mass casualty events, the distinction between cyber attack and conventional warfare becomes meaningless. State-sponsored advanced persistent threat groups now possess capabilities that rival nuclear weapons in their potential for societal destruction. Russian APT groups have demonstrated ability to manipulate industrial control systems, potentially causing chemical plant explosions or power grid cascading failures that could kill thousands. Chinese cyber units have penetrated water treatment facilities, transportation networks, and hospital systems across multiple continents, creating the infrastructure for coordinated attacks that could cripple entire regions simultaneously. The final frontier becomes the first battlefield. For 100 miles above Earth's surface, in the vacuum of space where no human can survive unprotected, a new category of warfare emerges that threatens to blind and deafen the early warning systems that have prevented nuclear war for decades. Space warfare represents perhaps the most destabilizing military development since nuclear weapons themselves, because it targets the eyes and ears of nuclear deterrence, the satellite systems that detect incoming missiles, coordinate retaliation, and provide the communications necessary for crisis management. For nations now possess demonstrated anti-satellite weapons capabilities, with Russia reportedly developing nuclear-powered ASAT systems that could violate the Outer Space Treaty while eliminating entire satellite constellations in single attacks. These are not precision weapons designed to disable individual satellites, but area effect systems that could create cascading destruction across orbital layers, potentially blinding all participants in conflicts that escalate to space warfare. The targeting of early warning satellites represents strategic instability unprecedented in nuclear history. These systems provide the detection capabilities that allow nuclear-armed states to distinguish between genuine attacks and false alarms, the communications that enable crisis management, and the timing that permits measured responses rather than automatic retaliation. Loss of satellite early warning creates use or lose calculations where nuclear forces might launch preemptively rather than risk destruction by undetected attacks. China's anti-satellite program has achieved capabilities that could eliminate American military communications within hours of conflict commencement. The People's Liberation Army's demonstration of kinetic kill vehicles, directed energy weapons, and cyber attack capabilities against satellite systems suggests preparation for space dominance strategies that would leave American forces deaf, dumb, and blind during Pacific conflicts. Russia's rumored development of nuclear-powered anti-satellite systems represents perhaps the most dangerous escalation of space warfare. Unlike conventional ASAT weapons that target individual satellites, nuclear detonations in space could disable entire orbital layers through electromagnetic pulse effects, potentially destroying the satellite infrastructure of all nations simultaneously. The mere deployment of such systems could trigger preemptive attacks by other space powers seeking to preserve their orbital assets. The compression of forever. The most alarming characteristic of tomorrow's weapons is their compression of decision-making time to intervals incompatible with human cognition. Hypersonic weapons traveling at Mach 27 speeds provide less than 5 minutes of warning compared to the 30-minute windows that Cold War systems assumed. Cyber attacks execute in milliseconds. Satellite destruction occurs faster than ground-based observers can detect. Autonomous weapons engage targets in timeframes measured in microseconds rather than minutes. This temporal compression eliminates the human intervention opportunities that saved civilization during previous crises. Arkhipov had hours to reconsider his torpedo launch decision. Petrov possessed 10 minutes to evaluate incoming missile reports. Yeltsin confronted 8 minutes to assess the Norwegian rocket threat. Modern weapons and their corresponding defensive systems may require responses within seconds or milliseconds, timeframes that eliminate human judgment entirely. Artificial intelligence integration into nuclear command and control systems represents the final elimination of human decision-making from the most important choices in history. All major nuclear powers now employ AI for threat detection, target identification, and response recommendation. While humans theoretically retain launch authority, the compression of decision-making timelines may effectively delegate life-or-death choices to algorithmic systems operating at speeds incompatible with biological decision-making processes. The mathematical reality is stark. Human reaction times average 250 milliseconds for simple decisions, several seconds for complex choices, and minutes for decisions involving moral considerations. Modern weapons operate in nanoseconds, execute attacks in microseconds, and coordinate responses across global networks faster than neurons can transmit signals between brain cells. The biological basis of human decision-making, the neural networks that allowed previous heroes to choose peace over war, may prove inadequate for survival in an age of algorithmic warfare. The algorithmic apocalypse. Social media manipulation and AI-generated disinformation represent another category of tomorrow's weapons, targeting the democratic decision-making processes required for crisis resolution. The 2024 elections demonstrated information warfare's evolution, with false content achieving 70% higher sharing rates than truthful information, while deepfake technology enables synthetic video and audio at scale. Russia's Internet Research Agency, China's Information Support Force, and Iran's Cognitive Design Production Center represent state-sponsored manipulation capabilities designed to destabilize target populations during crises. When genuine crises develop, these information warfare capabilities could prevent the rational policy responses required for de-escalation. Public opinion manipulation, deepfake evidence of atrocities, and algorithmic amplification of extremist positions could create domestic political pressures that force leaders into aggressive responses they know are dangerous. Democratic decision-making requires informed populations capable of rational deliberation, precisely what information warfare is designed to eliminate. The convergence of autonomous weapons, cyber warfare capabilities, space-based assets, and information manipulation creates what military strategists call multi-domain operations, conflicts that unfold simultaneously across land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace at speeds that eliminate human coordination. Future wars may begin and escalate through algorithmic interactions between competing artificial intelligence systems, with human leaders learning about hostilities only after autonomous systems have already exchanged fire across multiple domains. As we stand at the threshold of this algorithmic future, the echoes of human heroism that saved our species grow fainter with each technological advancement. The weapons of tomorrow's war do not pause for conscience, do not hesitate for moral consideration, do not provide the precious seconds that allowed unknown individuals to choose survival over destruction. In the server farms where artificial intelligences train for warfare, in the orbital layers where satellites prepare for destruction, in the fiber optic cables where invisible armies marshal for battle, tomorrow's weapons await their moment. When that moment comes, there may be no time for heroes, no space for conscience, no opportunity for the human intervention that has preserved our species through 6 decades of nuclear peril. The future of warfare thinks faster than we can, decides quicker than we can comprehend, and kills more efficiently than we can imagine. And it is arriving ahead of schedule. The economic chokehold. As these weapons of tomorrow await their algorithmic moment, a more insidious form of warfare has already begun, one that requires no bullets, no explosions, no dramatic declarations of hostilities. This is economic warfare elevated to an art form, where the sinews of global commerce become instruments of national destruction, where the very systems that bind our interconnected world together can be weaponized to strangle entire civilizations without firing a single shot. In the gleaming towers of financial districts, in the subterranean data centers that process trillions of dollars daily, and most critically, on a small island 100 miles off the Chinese coast, lie the economic choke points that could determine the outcome of World War III before the first hypersonic missile ever launches. The Silicon Stranglehold, Taiwan's ultimate weapon. In the sprawling industrial complexes of Hsinchu, on an island that most Americans could not locate on a map, lies perhaps the most strategically valuable territory in human history. Here, in the humidity-controlled clean rooms of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company and its competitors, 92% of the world's most advanced computer chips are produced by workers who may not realize they hold the technological foundation of modern civilization in their hands. These are not ordinary semiconductors, but the cutting-edge processors that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets, from artificial intelligence systems to the guidance computers of nuclear missiles themselves. The mathematics of this dependency are staggering in their implications. Taiwan produces virtually all of the world's semiconductors below 7 nanometers, the advanced chips essential for modern military systems, 5G networks, and the artificial intelligence weapons we have just witnessed. A complete shutdown of Taiwanese production would cost the global economy over $1 trillion in immediate losses while crippling the military capabilities of every major power within months. The RAND Corporation's classified tabletop exercises revealed no good short-term options for responding to Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain disruption, highlighting how modern warfare would be decided by economic strangulation as much as military action. China's potential invasion of Taiwan represents not merely territorial conquest, but the seizure of global technological dominance. Beijing's control over semiconductor production would provide leverage over every military system, every communications network, every advanced economy on Earth. American F-35 fighters require over 400 specialized chips per aircraft. Chinese disruption of semiconductor supplies could ground entire air forces without destroying a single plane, could disable nuclear command systems without launching cyber attacks, could paralyze civilian infrastructure without targeting power grids. The island's vulnerability extends beyond its geographic isolation to the extreme complexity of semiconductor manufacturing itself. The production of advanced chips requires over 1,000 discrete steps, involving materials sourced from dozens of countries, equipment manufactured by specialized firms in Netherlands and Germany, and expertise concentrated in a handful of facilities that cannot be quickly replicated elsewhere. Destroying Taiwan's semiconductor capability would require not massive bombardment, but surgical strikes on specific facilities containing irreplaceable equipment worth billions of dollars and requiring years to rebuild. Intel Corporation's attempts to build equivalent facilities in Arizona and Ohio reveal the impossibility of rapid semiconductor supply chain replacement. Despite massive federal subsidies and expedited permitting, these fabs will not achieve full production capacity until the 2030s, far too late to matter in conflicts anticipated for 2025 to 2027. Europe's semiconductor ambitions face similar timelines, while China's domestic chip industry remains generations behind Taiwan's technological leadership despite decades of intensive investment. Energy as the ultimate weapon. 8,000 miles away, in the frost-covered pipeline stations of Siberia, and the windswept platforms of the North Sea. Another form of economic warfare has already demonstrated its devastating effectiveness. Russia's weaponization of energy supplies during the Ukraine war revealed how resource dependencies could impose costs comparable to wartime mobilization without direct military engagement, while creating political pressures that threaten the alliance cohesion necessary for sustained military operations. The numbers tell the story of economic devastation achieved through resource cutoffs. Russia's closure of the Nord Stream pipeline eliminated 55 billion cubic meters of annual gas capacity, causing immediate 20% increases in European energy prices and forcing massive economic restructuring across the continent. The European Union's reduction of Russian gas imports from 40% to 15% required emergency measures comparable to wartime rationing. Industrial shutdowns, residential heating restrictions, and emergency financial support packages totaling hundreds of billions of euros. The economic warfare extended beyond simple supply cutoffs to sophisticated manipulation of energy markets. Russia's coordination with allied producers created artificial scarcity that drove global energy prices to record levels, imposing inflation costs on Western economies while generating massive revenue increases for energy exporters aligned with Moscow. The strategy demonstrated how resource-rich authoritarian states could use energy exports as precision weapons, targeting specific industries, regions, or political constituencies to maximize domestic pressure on democratic governments. China's control over rare earth processing creates similar leverage through different mechanisms. Beijing controls 61% of global graphite production and 80% of rare earth mineral processing materials essential for electric vehicle batteries, wind turbine magnets, and advanced military systems. Chinese export restrictions on these materials could cripple renewable energy transitions while disabling the defense industrial base of adversary nations, creating conditions where environmental goals conflict directly with national security requirements. The geographic concentration of critical energy infrastructure creates additional vulnerabilities that conflict planners exploit through both military and economic strategies. The Strait of Hormuz carries 21% of global petroleum liquids through a waterway narrow enough that Iranian mines or missiles could create shipping insurance crises that shut down energy flows without directly attacking tankers. Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq facility processes 7% of global oil production at a single location that Iranian drones successfully struck in 2019, demonstrating how precision attacks on individual facilities could create global energy crises. The financial nuclear option. In the glass towers of Lower Manhattan, in the secure communication centers that process 42 million daily SWIFT messages for 11,000 financial institutions worldwide, the most sophisticated economic weapon ever devised hums quietly through fiber optic cables that carry more destructive potential than nuclear arsenals. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication represents the central nervous system of global finance, and exclusion from this network has proven capable of destroying national economies more effectively than conventional military campaigns. The deployment of financial warfare against Russia following its Ukraine invasion demonstrated both the power and limitations of economic weapons. Cutting major Russian banks from SWIFT caused immediate 30% ruble devaluation, while asset freezes eliminated access to $300 billion in foreign currency reserves accumulated over decades. The combination of financial sanctions and export controls reduced Russian GDP by an estimated 15% within the first year of implementation, imposing costs that exceeded the damage from strategic bombing campaigns during previous wars. Yet, the Russian experience also revealed the adaptive potential of targeted economies. Moscow's development of alternative payment systems, its pivot toward trade relationships with non-aligned nations, and its success in maintaining energy exports to Asian markets demonstrated how determined adversaries could develop sanctions-resistant financial architectures. Russian revenues from energy exports, despite Western sanctions, exceeded pre-war levels during peak pricing periods in 2022, suggesting that financial warfare success depends on comprehensive international cooperation that may prove impossible to maintain during extended conflicts. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, represents the most sophisticated challenge to Western financial dominance, processing transactions in yuan while providing sanctions-resistant infrastructure for nations seeking alternatives to dollar-denominated systems. CIPS volume has grown 50% annually and could match SWIFT processing capacity within the decade, potentially creating parallel financial architectures that eliminate Western leverage over global economic relationships. The weaponization of financial systems creates reciprocal vulnerabilities that could destabilize global commerce during major power conflicts. American banks' exposure to Chinese markets, European integration with Russian energy systems, and Asian dependence on Western financial infrastructure create mutual dependencies that transform financial warfare into economic mutual assured destruction. The interconnected nature of global finance means that attacks on adversary financial systems could trigger cascading failures that damage attackers as severely as targets. The vulnerable arteries of globalization. Beneath the waves of international waters, in the depths where sunlight never penetrates, lie the fiber optic cables that carry 99% of intercontinental internet traffic, 430 cables spanning 1.2 million kilometers of ocean floor, representing perhaps the most critical and vulnerable infrastructure in human civilization. These slender threads of glass and copper, no thicker than garden hoses, carry the communications that coordinate global finance, the data that enables international commerce, and the information flows that maintain diplomatic contact during crises. The vulnerability of undersea cable infrastructure represents an unprecedented threat to global stability. Chinese state-owned firms participate in over 20 cable installation projects, providing detailed knowledge of cable locations, landing points, and technical specifications that could enable targeted attacks during conflicts. Russian research vessel Yantar conducts systematic surveillance of cable routes, mapping infrastructure that could be severed to isolate entire regions from global communications networks. The effects of cable disruption extend far beyond internet outages to encompass financial system paralysis, military communication breakdown, and diplomatic isolation that could prevent crisis management. The concentration of cable landing points in specific geographic locations creates single points of failure where limited attacks could isolate entire continents. Attacks on the 15 cables serving Europe could eliminate the continent's connection to global financial systems within hours, while similar strikes on Pacific cables could isolate Asian economies from Western markets. Strategic choke points throughout the global economy create additional vulnerabilities that military planners incorporate into conflict scenarios. The Suez Canal carries 12% of global trade through a waterway so narrow that a single container ship, as demonstrated by the Ever Given incident, can shut down international commerce for weeks. The Strait of Malacca handles 25% of global trade while remaining vulnerable to closure through military action, piracy, or deliberate obstruction. The mathematics of mutual destruction. The interconnected nature of modern economic warfare creates strategic calculations unlike any previous military planning. Traditional warfare assumed that damage inflicted on enemies would strengthen relative national positions. Economic warfare in an interconnected global system creates mutual vulnerabilities, where attacks on adversaries often damage attackers through supply chain disruption, financial system instability, and trade relationship collapse. China's potential seizure of Taiwan would provide Beijing with semiconductor dominance while simultaneously crippling Chinese technology companies dependent on Taiwanese production. Russian energy weapon deployment succeeded in raising European costs while reducing Russian revenues through decreased export volumes and alternative supplier development. Financial warfare against major economies risks triggering global recession that damages all participants through reduced trade, investment, and economic growth. The timeframes for economic warfare effects often exceed those of military campaigns, creating strategic dilemmas about whether economic weapons can achieve decisive results before adversaries adapt through alternative suppliers, substitute technologies, or alliance restructuring. Russian sanction evasion demonstrates how determined nations can develop workarounds that restore substantial capabilities within months rather than years. Yet the psychological and political effects of economic warfare may prove more decisive than immediate material damage. Democratic society's sensitivity to economic disruption creates domestic pressure for conflict termination that authoritarian governments can exploit through precision targeting of specific industries, regions, or electoral constituencies. The ability to impose economic pain on civilian populations while maintaining plausible deniability about military aggression represents a form of warfare particularly suited to gray zone conflicts that avoid triggering alliance response mechanisms. The coming economic storm. As we contemplate the 6 gates that could open simultaneously, The economic dimensions of potential global conflict suggest that World War III may be decided by supply chain control, financial system dominance, and infrastructure vulnerability rather than traditional military superiority. The nation that controls semiconductor production, maintains energy security, dominates financial networks, and protects critical infrastructure may achieve victory without winning battles in any conventional sense. The convergence of Taiwan's semiconductor crisis, energy weapon deployment, financial system competition, and infrastructure vulnerability creates conditions where economic warfare could escalate to military conflict through mechanisms that existing diplomatic institutions were never designed to address. When economic strangulation threatens national survival, the temptation to resolve economic vulnerabilities through military action may prove irresistible to leaders facing domestic pressure and international isolation. In the clean rooms of Taiwan, in the pipeline control stations of Siberia, in the financial data centers of Manhattan, the weapons of economic warfare await their moment of deployment. Unlike the missiles and warships of previous conflicts, these weapons operate continuously, their effects accumulating gradually until the moment when gradual pressure becomes intolerable crisis, when economic competition becomes national emergency, when the chokehold tightens beyond the point of peaceful resolution. The economy has become the battlefield, and the battlefield may soon become everything. When allies become enemies. As the economic chokehold tightens around the throat of global commerce, an even more sinister transformation unfolds in the marble halls of diplomatic institutions and the secure conference rooms where alliance leaders once spoke with unified voices. The very systems designed to prevent global warfare, the treaties signed in blood after humanity's darkest hours, the alliances forged in the crucible of world wars, the international institutions built from the ashes of atomic destruction, now crack under pressures they were never designed to withstand. In the gilded chambers of the United Nations, in the sterile briefing rooms of NATO headquarters, and within the encrypted communication networks that once carried messages of cooperation, a terrifying reality emerges. The guardians of peace have become the gravediggers of diplomacy. The Article 5 paradox, when collective defense becomes collective suicide. Deep within the underground command center at NATO headquarters in Brussels, alliance officials monitor a paradox that could destroy the organization they have sworn to protect. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the sacred commitment that an attack on one member constitutes an attack on all, faces its greatest test not from external aggression, but from internal contradictions that threaten to transform collective defense into collective annihilation. The mathematical reality is stark and unforgiving. NATO's Article 5 has been invoked only once in 75 years, yet current global tensions create scenarios where multiple simultaneous invocations could trigger cascading warfare that destroys the alliance through the very mechanisms designed to preserve it. The Article 5 process requires North Atlantic Council assessment and consensus decisions designed for deliberative response to clear aggression, not the hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, and gradual escalation that characterize current threats. Recent NATO statements suggesting that hybrid operations could trigger Article 5 create dangerous ambiguity about response thresholds while decision-making processes remain incompatible with conflicts that could escalate from regional to global within hours. When hypersonic weapons compress warning times to minutes and autonomous systems execute attacks in milliseconds, the careful consultation procedures that Article 5 requires become not just inadequate, but potentially suicidal. The Trump administration's strained relations with NATO allies over Ukraine support illuminate fundamental contradictions within alliance structures. American demands for increased European defense spending conflict with European preferences for diplomatic solutions, while disagreements over Ukraine aid create uncertainty about collective defense commitments that could encourage adversary testing of alliance resolve. When allies cannot agree on supporting non-members under attack, their credibility for defending each other becomes questionable. Baltic states' vulnerability represents the most dangerous Article 5 scenario, where Russian aggression could trigger alliance-wide response within minutes of commencement. NATO's enhanced forward presence deploys multinational battalions designed to serve as tripwires rather than defensive forces, ensuring that Russian attacks would immediately involve multiple alliance members. The strategy transforms collective defense into automatic escalation, where local conflicts become global wars through alliance mechanisms rather than strategic choice. The Kaliningrad corridor creates additional vulnerabilities where Russian movements through Lithuania could trigger Article 5 responses that escalate to nuclear confrontation within hours. NATO's inability to reinforce Baltic positions without crossing Russian territory or using contested airspace means that Article 5 commitments may prove impossible to honor through conventional means, potentially forcing alliance leaders to choose between nuclear escalation and alliance dissolution. The silence of the Security Council. In the iconic chamber where the United Nations Security Council once symbolized humanity's commitment to peaceful conflict resolution, an ominous silence has descended that speaks louder than any diplomatic protest. The very institution designed to prevent global warfare has become paralyzed by the conflicts it was created to resolve, its mechanisms rendered impotent by the strategic competition among its most powerful members. The Security Council's paralysis during great power conflicts eliminates the primary international mechanism for conflict prevention and resolution. Russia and China's increased use of vetoes, 58 since 2000 with dramatic increases in recent years, demonstrates how the system fails precisely when most needed. Reform initiatives, including the Veto Initiative, requiring General Assembly convening within 10 days, face the fundamental obstacle that any structural change requires unanimous consent from the permanent members who benefit from current arrangements. The mathematical progression is terrifying in its implications. Every major crisis involving permanent Security Council members triggers vetoes that prevent international intervention, while the accumulation of unresolved conflicts creates conditions where multiple wars could erupt simultaneously without any institutional mechanism for coordination or de-escalation. When the world's primary conflict resolution body becomes a forum for legitimizing aggression rather than preventing it, the international order approaches systemic collapse. Recent Security Council dynamics reveal how competitive vetoing has transformed peaceful dispute resolution into diplomatic warfare. Russian vetoes on Ukraine-related resolutions exceed 15 since 2022, while Chinese support for Russian positions demonstrates how great power alignment can neutralize international law enforcement entirely. The precedent suggests that future conflicts involving permanent members will face automatic Security Council paralysis, eliminating even the possibility of diplomatic intervention. The UN Secretary-General's diminished role reflects broader institutional decline where moral authority cannot compete with military power. Antonio Guterres' warnings about global conflict risks carry no enforcement mechanisms, while his attempts at mediation face systematic obstruction from the very powers whose cooperation is essential for success. The transformation of the UN from conflict resolver to conflict observer represents perhaps the most dangerous institutional failure since the League of Nations collapsed in the 1930s. Communication breakdown, when hotlines go cold. In the secure communication centers where red phones once provided direct channels between superpower leaders, a new form of warfare has emerged that targets the very systems designed to prevent nuclear catastrophe. The hotlines, secure networks, and diplomatic protocols that enabled crisis management during previous decades now face cyber attacks, technical failures, and deliberate disruption that could eliminate the communications essential for preventing World War III. U.S.-China crisis communications suffer from critical vulnerabilities that could prove fatal during rapidly developing conflicts. Chinese refusal to answer hotlines during the 1999 Belgrade bombing, 2001 Hainan incident, and 2023 balloon crisis demonstrates systematic problems with communication protocols designed for different threat environments. The 48-hour response timeline is incompatible with hypersonic weapon speeds, while Chinese requirements for political approval before communication eliminate the immediate access essential for crisis management. Military-to-military communications restored after the November 2023 Biden-Xi summit remain slow and bureaucratic, with greater than 50% probability that hotlines would fail during major conflicts. The systems assume functioning internet and satellite communications that cyber warfare or electromagnetic pulse effects could eliminate in conflicts' opening minutes, leaving nuclear-armed powers unable to communicate during the precise moments when communication becomes most critical. Russian communication systems face similar vulnerabilities, with diplomatic protocols dependent on technologies not hardened for nuclear warfare environments. The Moscow-Washington hotline, established after the Cuban Missile Crisis, relies on commercial communication infrastructure vulnerable to cyber attack, electromagnetic interference, and deliberate sabotage. When communication systems themselves become military targets, the mechanisms for preventing escalation may be eliminated before conflicts reach nuclear thresholds. India-Pakistan communication problems during the May 2025 crisis required American intervention to prevent escalation, demonstrating how communication failures between nuclear powers can force third-party involvement that transforms bilateral disputes into multilateral confrontations. The crisis revealed that existing hotlines functioned adequately for routine diplomatic business but failed under the stress conditions that make communication most essential. Alliance entropy, the mathematics of disintegration. Regional alliance structures throughout the world show signs of entropy that accelerate under the pressure of current crises. The Quad's expansion beyond security cooperation to pandemic preparedness and technology sharing demonstrates institutional innovation, but India's strategic autonomy prevents formal military alliance commitments that would provide meaningful security guarantees. The result is an organization that appears substantial but lacks the binding commitments necessary for credible deterrence. AUKUS represents fundamental shifts in Indo-Pacific military balance through nuclear submarine technology transfer, but Australian capabilities will not become operational until the 2040s, creating dangerous capability gaps during the critical 2025 to 2027 window when China may act against Taiwan. The alliance's focus on long-term capability development provides little deterrent value during immediate crisis scenarios where current military balance determines outcomes. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization's evolution from economic cooperation to security alliance demonstrates how authoritarian powers develop alternative institutional frameworks that compete directly with Western alliance systems. SCO military exercises involving nuclear powers create coordination mechanisms that could prove crucial during conflicts with NATO or Pacific alliances, while economic integration through the Belt and Road Initiative provides material incentives for alignment with Chinese strategic objectives. Middle Eastern alliance structures remain fragmented by sectarian conflicts, territorial disputes, and competitive relationships that prevent effective coordination against common threats. The Abraham Accords' focus on Israeli-Arab normalization has been overtaken by direct Israel-Iran warfare that forces regional powers to choose sides in ways that could fragment any potential anti-Iranian coalition. Saudi Arabia's strategic hedging between American security guarantees and Chinese economic partnerships exemplifies regional unwillingness to accept exclusive alliance commitments. The failure of crisis architecture. Intelligence sharing mechanisms that once provided early warning of developing threats now face systematic penetration and manipulation that transforms cooperative security into strategic vulnerability. Chinese infiltration of Five Eyes intelligence networks, Russian cyber operations against NATO communication systems, and Iranian hacking of Israeli defense databases demonstrate how adversaries exploit alliance cooperation mechanisms to gather intelligence and spread disinformation. The compression of crisis timelines eliminates the consultation periods that alliance decision-making requires, creating scenarios where individual member nations may be forced to respond to attacks before alliance consensus can be achieved. The mathematical reality is unforgiving. When hypersonic weapons provide 5-minute warning times and alliance consultation requires hours or days, collective defense becomes strategically impossible rather than merely politically difficult. Track 2 Diplomacy. The unofficial communications between non-governmental experts that often provide crucial back-channel dialogue during crises faces systematic erosion through visa restrictions, academic exchange limitations, and legal constraints that eliminate the informal networks essential for crisis communication. Russian legislation restricting foreign academic cooperation, Chinese controls on international academic exchange, and American restrictions on technology sharing create legal barriers to the informal dialogue that often prevents formal conflicts. The accumulation of failed negotiations, violated agreements, and broken commitments creates what diplomatic theorists call agreement fatigue, the systematic loss of faith in diplomatic solutions that makes military options appear more attractive to decision-makers facing international pressures. When diplomatic institutions consistently fail to resolve disputes, when agreements are systematically violated without consequences, when negotiations produce outcomes that satisfy no participant, the alternative of military action gains credibility that diplomatic solutions lose. The point of no return. As crisis communication systems fail, alliance commitments become contradictory, and diplomatic institutions prove impotent, the international order approaches what systems theorists call cascade failure, the point where institutional breakdown accelerates beyond the possibility of repair or replacement. Unlike previous institutional crises that occurred during peacetime periods that allowed for gradual reform, current institutional failures occur simultaneously with the six gates of potential warfare that could open without warning. The mathematical progression suggests that institutional failure and military crisis feed upon each other in ways that make peaceful resolution increasingly improbable. Failed diplomacy encourages military preparation that creates security dilemmas, while military buildups undermine trust necessary for diplomatic solutions that could prevent the conflicts that military preparation makes more likely. When allies become suspicious of each other's commitments, when international institutions become forums for competitive posturing rather than cooperation, when communication systems become targets rather than tools for peace, the architecture of crisis prevention transforms into the infrastructure of warfare itself. In the echoing chambers where diplomats once prevented wars, in the secure networks where allies once coordinated responses, in the institutional frameworks that once channeled competition into peaceful rivalry, silence grows where voices of reason once prevailed. The systems designed to prevent global catastrophe have become the mechanisms through which catastrophe may arrive, not as external shock, but as internal collapse of everything that once stood between humanity and the abyss. When the guardians of peace become the architects of destruction, when the instruments of cooperation become the weapons of competition, when the last voices of reason fall silent in chambers designed for dialogue, the world moves beyond the point where institutional solutions remain possible. The allies have become suspicious, the enemies have become bold, and the systems that once prevented global war now accelerate its approach with mathematical precision that no treaty can reverse, no alliance can prevent, no institution can control. The danger window, 2025 to 2027. As the institutional guardians of peace crumble into suspicious fragments and the diplomatic machinery of crisis prevention seizes with rust and mistrust, a terrible convergence approaches that transforms abstract possibilities into mathematical certainties. Intelligence analysts across 6 continents have identified what they euphemistically call the window, a 3-year period when multiple catastrophic factors align with the precision of celestial mechanics to create conditions more dangerous than any moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Unlike previous threats that emerged gradually or individually, this convergence involves simultaneous deadlines, coordinated preparations, and strategic calculations that compress decades of potential conflict into a narrow time frame where a single miscalculation could trigger species-ending warfare. The clock that began ticking in underground bunkers now counts down not in years or months, but in days and hours toward a moment when all 6 gates could open simultaneously. China's countdown to Taiwan. The 2027 Directive. In the secure briefing rooms of the People's Liberation Army headquarters in Beijing, military planners work toward a deadline that has assumed the force of historical destiny. Xi Jinping's directive for PLA readiness by 2027 represents not merely military preparation, but the culmination of a strategic timeline that Chinese leadership believes offers optimal conditions for resolving the Taiwan question through force. This is not speculative future planning, but active preparation for operations that could commence within 24 months. Creating the most dangerous military buildup since Nazi Germany prepared for European invasion. The 2027 deadline reflects Chinese assessment of multiple converging factors that create what Beijing strategists call the window of maximum opportunity. Chinese military modernization will peak during this period, with hypersonic weapons deployment, naval capabilities achieving parity with U.S. Pacific forces, and nuclear arsenal expansion providing escalation options unavailable during previous Taiwan crises. The Pentagon's own assessments acknowledge that 2027 represents the point where Chinese military capabilities could overcome American Pacific defenses, fundamentally altering strategic calculations that have maintained Taiwan's de facto independence for 7 decades. American intelligence agencies have confirmed that Chinese preparations extend far beyond military exercises into systematic infrastructure development, economic stockpiling, and diplomatic coordination that suggest concrete operational planning rather than abstract deterrent posturing. The construction of military hospitals near Taiwan-facing coastlines, the stockpiling of medical supplies consistent with massive casualty expectations, and the development of civilian shipping requisition procedures all point toward preparations for sustained military operations beginning no later than 2027. Chinese strategic calculations involve more than military capability, encompassing domestic political imperatives that make Taiwan action increasingly inevitable. Xi Jinping's elimination of presidential term limits creates personal political incentives for historical legacy achievement, while Chinese economic growth deceleration generates domestic pressure for nationalist triumph that could offset economic disappointment. The demographic transition toward an aging population creates time pressures where military action becomes more costly with each passing year, encouraging action during the current window rather than future delays. Taiwan's 2028 presidential election cycle adds urgency to Chinese calculations, as democratic transitions could produce leadership less amenable to unification negotiations. The current DPP administration's independence-leaning policies provide Beijing with justification for military intervention, while future electoral outcomes remain unpredictable in ways that encourage Chinese action during periods of known political conditions rather than uncertain democratic transitions. North Korea's nuclear constitution, the 2025 completion. Simultaneously, in the hermetic isolation of North Korea's nuclear facilities, another deadline approaches with the force of constitutional mandate. Kim Jong-un's 5-year military development plan reaches completion in 2025, coinciding with constitutional requirements for exponential nuclear warhead production that transform nuclear weapons from deterrent tools into fundamental expressions of state identity. This represents qualitative change in nuclear proliferation, where atomic weapons become not strategic options but constitutional obligations that eliminate diplomatic flexibility. The regime's achievement of an estimated 50 nuclear warheads with sufficient fissile material for 40 more represents exponential growth from 0 weapons in 2003, demonstrating capability for continued expansion that could reach 3-digit arsenals within the decade. More significantly, North Korea's development of tactical nuclear weapons designed for battlefield use, including underwater nuclear weapon systems successfully tested in 2024, creates escalation pathways where regional conflicts could rapidly transition to nuclear exchange. North Korea's constitutional mandate for nuclear expansion creates domestic legal requirements that eliminate the policy flexibility essential for diplomatic resolution. Unlike other nuclear powers that treat atomic weapons as strategic tools subject to political control, North Korea's constitutional framework makes nuclear expansion a legal obligation that cannot be negotiated away without fundamental regime change. This creates irreversible momentum toward nuclear expansion that diplomatic pressure cannot address through traditional incentive structures. The timing of North Korean nuclear completion with Chinese Taiwan preparations is not coincidental but represents coordinated strategic planning designed to overwhelm American capacity for simultaneous crisis management. North Korean nuclear testing, provocations, or aggressive actions during Chinese Taiwan operations could create two-front scenarios where American forces face nuclear threats in Northeast Asia while conducting high-intensity operations in the Taiwan Strait. South Korea's consideration of independent nuclear deterrent development in response to northern threats adds additional destabilizing elements to Northeast Asian dynamics. The potential for South Korean nuclear weapons development could trigger Chinese or North Korean preemptive action designed to prevent further proliferation, creating three-way nuclear dynamics where any bilateral conflict could expand into regional nuclear warfare involving multiple atomic arsenals. The Middle Eastern meltdown, Iran's nuclear threshold. The fragile ceasefire following June 2025 Israel-Iran direct warfare masks continued preparation for resumed hostilities that could explode with greater violence than any previous Middle Eastern conflict. Iran's nuclear program remains weeks away from weapons-grade uranium production, according to International Atomic Energy Agency assessments, creating timeline pressures where preventive military action becomes more likely as capabilities approach weaponization thresholds. Israeli military planning operates on assumptions that Iranian nuclear weaponization represents an existential threat requiring military response regardless of international opposition or escalation risks. The June 2025 strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities demonstrated Israeli willingness to risk regional warfare to prevent Persian atomic capabilities, while Iranian retaliation against Israeli territory showed how quickly Middle Eastern conflicts escalate beyond containment through traditional diplomatic intervention. The Trump administration's strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities following the June escalation create American involvement in direct warfare between Iran and Israel, eliminating the possibility that future conflicts could remain limited to regional participants. American military assets across the region in Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain provide Iran with automatic escalation targets that could transform bilateral Israel-Iran conflicts into trilateral confrontations involving the world's largest military power. Iranian capabilities for Strait of Hormuz closure create global economic leverage that could draw additional powers into Middle Eastern conflicts through energy security requirements. The strait carries 21% of global petroleum liquids through waterways narrow enough that Iranian mines, missiles, or Revolutionary Guard naval units could create international shipping crises that force military intervention by energy-dependent nations worldwide. The alignment of potential Israeli preemptive strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities with Chinese Taiwan operations and North Korean provocations creates scenarios where American forces face simultaneous military requirements across 3 regions, potentially exceeding strategic capacity for effective response in any individual theater while creating opportunities for coordinated action by adversarial powers. Russia's Ukrainian gambit. The endgame approaches. In the frozen trenches of eastern Ukraine, where 3 years of warfare have created conditions resembling World War I battlefields with 21st-century weapons, Russian strategic calculations approach their own critical inflection point. Putin's regime faces domestic pressures, international sanctions, and military costs that create time pressures for decisive action during the 2025 to 2027 window rather than indefinite conflict prolongation. Russian territorial gains in 2024, 4,000 square kilometers representing the largest advances since the invasion's opening months, demonstrate military momentum that could encourage escalation designed to achieve decisive victory before Western support solidifies into permanent Ukrainian military advantage. The mathematical progression suggests that current attrition rates favor Russian forces with superior manpower and industrial capacity, creating incentives for escalated operations designed to exploit temporary advantages. NATO weapons systems engaging Russian forces in direct combat create precedents for Russian retaliation against NATO territory under Moscow's modified nuclear doctrine. Putin's November 2024 declaration that conventional attacks by nuclear allies constitute grounds for nuclear response represents fundamental threshold lowering that transforms every Ukrainian operation using Western weapons into potential triggers for atomic warfare involving multiple nuclear powers. The Trump administration's uncertain commitment to continued Ukrainian support creates Russian incentives for major operations designed to achieve irreversible territorial gains before American policy potentially shifts toward negotiated settlement. The possibility of reduced Western military aid creates time pressures where Russian action during the current window could prove more decisive than similar operations conducted under conditions of guaranteed long-term Western support. The perfect storm, convergent timelines. The mathematical reality of simultaneous crisis management requirements exceeds demonstrated American capacity for effective response across multiple theaters. Historical analysis of American military capabilities suggests maximum effective engagement in 2 major theater operations simultaneously, while current threat environment requires potential response to Chinese Taiwan invasion, North Korean nuclear aggression, Iran-Israel warfare, and Russian NATO testing within compressed timeframes that eliminate sequential response options. Intelligence assessments indicate coordination among authoritarian powers designed to exploit American overextension through synchronized timing of major operations. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization's military exercises, China-Russia strategic partnership developments, and Iran-North Korea technological cooperation suggest deliberate coordination designed to overwhelm Western response capacity through simultaneous action across multiple regions. Economic vulnerabilities created by Taiwan's semiconductor dependency, energy weapon deployment, and financial system competition compound military challenges by eliminating the economic stability necessary for sustained military operations. Chinese control over critical supply chains, Russian energy leverage, and potential financial system warfare could impose economic costs that exceed military spending capacity required for effective multi-theater operations. Domestic political constraints within democratic nations create additional time pressures where authoritarian powers may calculate that American and allied resolve weakens over time rather than strengthening. Public opinion polling suggests declining support for overseas military commitments across multiple Western democracies, encouraging adversarial action during periods of maximum domestic political support rather than future periods where war fatigue could reduce democratic fighting capacity. The point of maximum danger. Technological developments that achieve operational status during the 2025 to 2027 period create capabilities that did not exist during previous crises while eliminating the human intervention opportunities that prevented nuclear warfare during historical near misses. Hypersonic weapons deployment, artificial intelligence integration into military systems, and autonomous weapons proliferation create conditions where conflicts could escalate beyond human control faster than decision-makers can respond. The compression of decision-making timelines through technological advancement coincides with institutional breakdown that eliminates crisis management capabilities essential for preventing escalation during high-stress confrontations. When communication systems fail, alliance commitments conflict, and diplomatic institutions prove impotent, the technological acceleration of warfare removes the last safeguards against catastrophic escalation. Climate change impacts during this period add additional pressure through resource competition, population displacement, and agricultural disruption that create domestic instability within nuclear-armed states. The intersection of technological warfare capabilities with climate-induced social stress creates conditions where nuclear weapons could be used in response to environmental rather than military threats, expanding the scenarios where atomic warfare becomes strategically rational for desperate governments. The mathematical convergence is undeniable. Military modernization timelines, political succession cycles, economic vulnerability windows, technological deployment schedules, and institutional breakdown patterns align during 2025 to 2027 to create conditions of maximum global instability since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Unlike that singular confrontation between two superpowers with established communication channels and mutual understanding, current convergence involves multiple nuclear powers with competing alliance systems, uncertain communication protocols, and strategic objectives that may be fundamentally incompatible with peaceful coexistence. The window opens wider with each passing day, and behind it lies a storm that could reshape human civilization or end it entirely. The countdown has begun, and the mathematics of convergence suggest that humanity's date with destiny approaches faster than any diplomatic institution can comprehend, any military force can prepare for, or any political leader can control. Time is running out, and the window may close with the finality of a nuclear blast. The psychology of doomsday. As the mathematical certainty of convergence tightens around those critical years like a noose around humanity's collective neck, we arrive at perhaps the most terrifying realization of all. When the moment of ultimate decision arrives, when the fate of 8 billion human souls hangs in the balance, the choice between civilization and extinction will not be made by committees of wise advisors, sophisticated computer models, or carefully crafted institutional procedures. Instead, that choice will be made by individual human beings, flawed, frightened, exhausted people operating under conditions of unimaginable stress, with incomplete information, facing impossible deadlines, while their most primitive survival instincts scream louder than their rational minds. In the buried command bunkers where these decisions await their moment, in the psychology laboratories where researchers study decision-making under extreme duress, and in the classified case studies of previous near disasters, a chilling truth emerges. The future of our species depends not on the wisdom of our institutions, but on the frailty of human psychology when pushed beyond every limit that evolution designed us to endure. The neurochemistry of Armageddon. Deep within the synapses of the human brain, where electrical impulses carry the weight of existence itself, neuroscientists have mapped the biological processes that transform rational leaders into creatures of pure instinct when facing existential threats. The amygdala, that ancient alarm system inherited from ancestors who faced saber-toothed predators rather than nuclear missiles, floods the bloodstream with stress hormones that shut down the prefrontal cortex where rational deliberation occurs. Under conditions of extreme stress, the human brain literally cannot access the neural networks responsible for complex reasoning, moral consideration, or long-term consequence evaluation. The physiological changes that occur during nuclear crisis decision-making would be almost comical if they were not so terrifying. Heart rate spike to over 180 beats per minute, blood pressure reaches hypertensive crisis levels, and stress hormone concentrations approach those found in soldiers during active combat. The body's fight-or-flight response, designed for 30-second encounters with immediate physical threats, takes control of minds that must make decisions affecting the survival of human civilization. Research conducted at the Naval War College's Classified Decision-Making Laboratory reveals how rapidly cognitive function deteriorates under crisis conditions. Test subjects simulating nuclear launch decisions show measurable decline in analytical reasoning within minutes of stress onset, while exhibiting increased reliance on heuristic shortcuts and emotional responses. The more critical the decision, the less capable the human brain becomes of making it rationally. Temperature and environmental factors compound these psychological vulnerabilities in ways that could prove catastrophic during actual crises. Vasily Arkhipov made his world-saving decision while submarine B-59's internal temperature reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit and carbon dioxide levels approached lethal concentrations. Heat stress impairs cognitive function by reducing blood flow to the brain, while carbon dioxide poisoning creates disorientation and paranoia that could transform rational leaders into desperate actors willing to authorize nuclear weapons use based on faulty threat assessment. Sleep deprivation during extended crises creates additional vulnerabilities that decision-makers rarely acknowledge. Nuclear command authorities often face decisions after days of minimal sleep during international tensions, operating with cognitive impairment equivalent to legal intoxication. The irony is absolute. The most important decisions in human history are often made by leaders whose judgment has been compromised by the biological stress responses that crisis conditions inevitably produce. The temporal trap. When time becomes the enemy. The compression of decision-making timelines represents perhaps the greatest threat to rational nuclear crisis management, eliminating the deliberative processes that democratic theory assumes while forcing leaders to rely on instinct, prejudice, and fear rather than analysis, consultation, or moral reflection. Stanislav Petrov faced 10 minutes to determine whether incoming ICBMs were genuine attacks or false alarms, 10 minutes to decide whether human civilization would continue or end in nuclear fire. Modern weapons compress these already inadequate timelines to intervals that may eliminate human decision-making entirely. Hypersonic weapons traveling at Mach 27 speeds provide less than 5 minutes from detection to impact, while artificial intelligence systems integrated into military networks can identify threats, recommend responses, and implement countermeasures faster than human beings can comprehend the situation they face. The mathematical progression is terrifying in its implications. Human reaction times average 250 milliseconds for simple decisions, several seconds for complex choices, and minutes for decisions involving moral considerations. Nuclear command systems now operate in nanoseconds, execute attacks in microseconds, and coordinate responses across global networks faster than neurons can transmit signals between brain cells. The biological foundation of human decision-making may prove inadequate for survival in an age of algorithmic warfare. President Yeltsin's 8-minute window during the Norwegian rocket incident represents the maximum decision-making time that future leaders may face. Yet psychological research suggests that 8 minutes provides insufficient time for the rational deliberation that nuclear decisions require. Effective decision-making under stress requires information gathering, alternative evaluation, consequence assessment, and moral consideration, processes that typically require hours or days rather than minutes or seconds. The temporal compression creates what psychologists call action bias, the tendency to make any decision rather than no decision when facing time pressure. Nuclear command authorities under extreme time pressure may authorize weapons use not because they believe attack is necessary, but because doing nothing feels psychologically impossible when facing potential annihilation. The bias toward action rather than restraint could prove catastrophic when restraint represents the only rational choice. The isolation chamber, decision-making in the void. Nuclear decision-makers often face the ultimate choices in conditions of information isolation that eliminate the consultation and verification processes essential for rational judgment. Soviet submarine B-59 had received no communication from Moscow for days when Captain Savitsky ordered nuclear torpedo preparation, operating on assumptions about surface warfare that proved completely incorrect. This information isolation during crises is not accidental but represents systematic breakdown of communication systems under combat conditions. The security requirements that protect nuclear command systems from cyber attack also isolate decision-makers from the information flows necessary for accurate threat assessment. Secure communication networks designed to function during nuclear warfare often cannot access the commercial internet, news media, or diplomatic channels that provide crucial context during developing crises. Leaders making nuclear decisions may know less about the actual situation than informed civilians following events through social media. Intelligence failures compound information isolation by providing decision-makers with data that confirms their worst fears rather than accurate assessment of adversary intentions. The same intelligence agencies that convinced President Bush of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, that failed to predict the Soviet Union's collapse, that missed September 11th terrorist preparations, now provide the threat assessments that nuclear commanders use to determine whether incoming missiles represent genuine attacks or false alarms. Confirmation bias under stress creates psychological tendencies to interpret ambiguous information in ways that support predetermined assumptions about adversary threats. Leaders who expect attacks are more likely to interpret sensor data, intelligence reports, and diplomatic communications as evidence of hostile intentions, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where expectations of war make war more likely through misinterpretation of peaceful or defensive actions. The echo chamber effects within nuclear command structures eliminate the diverse perspectives essential for accurate threat assessment. Military advisors selected for loyalty and agreement with leadership positions may provide confirmation rather than challenge during crises when alternative perspectives become most crucial. The groupthink that results from homogeneous advisory structures could lead entire command systems toward catastrophic decisions that outside observers would recognize as obviously mistaken. The authoritarian advantage, when democracy becomes weakness. The concentration of nuclear decision-making authority within increasingly authoritarian political systems creates psychological conditions that may favor rapid escalation over careful deliberation. Xi Jinping's elimination of term limits, Putin's centralization of Russian authority, and Kim Jong-un's constitutional nuclear mandates suggest that nuclear decisions could be made more rapidly and with less consultation than democratic systems assume, creating asymmetric crisis dynamics where authoritarian speed advantages during initial conflict stages could force democratic nations into reactive postures that increase escalation risks. Authoritarian psychology often includes grandiose self-perception, intolerance for criticism, and belief in personal infallibility that could prove catastrophic during nuclear crises. Leaders who have eliminated domestic opposition, silenced critical media, and surrounded themselves with loyal subordinates may lack the psychological humility necessary for restraint when facing threats to personal power or national prestige. The rally around the flag effect that occurs during international crises creates domestic political incentives for aggressive responses that may conflict with rational crisis management. Authoritarian leaders facing domestic unrest, economic problems, or legitimacy challenges may perceive international confrontation as opportunities for political consolidation rather than threats to be avoided, creating psychological incentives for escalation that democratic leaders facing electoral accountability may not experience. Cult of personality dynamics within authoritarian systems create decision-making structures where individual psychological quirks become national strategic policies. Stalin's paranoia influenced Soviet military doctrine, Mao's revolutionary romanticism shaped Chinese nuclear strategy, and Hitler's megalomaniacal fantasies determined German war planning. Current authoritarian nuclear powers may face similar situations where individual psychological pathology determines global strategic stability. The elimination of institutional checks and balances within authoritarian systems reduces the political costs of catastrophic decision-making while increasing the personal benefits of aggressive posturing. Democratic leaders face congressional oversight, judicial review, media scrutiny, and electoral consequences that create incentives for careful deliberation. Authoritarian leaders may face no such constraints, particularly when nuclear weapons provide tools for eliminating domestic opposition through external threat creation. The fatalism factor, when war becomes inevitable. Perhaps most dangerous of all is the psychological dynamic that crisis researchers call fatalistic escalation. The tendency for leaders under extreme stress to conclude that war is inevitable and therefore act in ways that make war actual rather than potential. This self-fulfilling prophecy effect occurs when decision-makers become convinced that conflict cannot be avoided and therefore stop trying to avoid it, instead focusing on achieving advantageous positions for the inevitable warfare they believe is approaching. Historical analysis reveals how fatalistic thinking contributed to both world wars through leaders who concluded that conflict was unavoidable and therefore initiated preventive actions that transformed potential conflicts into actual wars. German leaders in 1914 believed that Russian mobilization made war inevitable, while German leaders in 1939 believed that British guarantees to Poland made general European conflict unavoidable. Similar fatalistic calculations could transform current tensions into actual warfare through leaders who conclude that confrontation cannot be avoided. Nuclear crisis psychology includes additional fatalistic elements where leaders may conclude that nuclear war is inevitable and therefore authorize preemptive strikes designed to minimize damage rather than prevent conflict. Use or lose calculations become psychologically compelling when leaders believe that adversaries are certain to attack, making first strike appear rational even when it guarantees the global catastrophe that restraint might prevent. The media coverage and expert analysis that emphasize the inevitability of great power conflict may contribute to fatalistic thinking among political leaders who internalize these predictions as accurate forecasts rather than warnings to be heeded. When respected analysts predict inevitable conflict, when intelligence agencies brief likely war scenarios, when military exercises assume combat operations, the psychological effect may be to normalize warfare as expected outcome rather than catastrophic failure to be avoided. Crisis escalation dynamics create psychological momentum where each aggressive action makes subsequent aggression appear more rational while making de-escalation appear more dangerous. Leaders who have invested political capital in confrontational policies may find retreat psychologically impossible even when retreat would serve national interests better than escalation. The sunk cost fallacy applied to international prestige could prevent the policy reversals necessary for peaceful crisis resolution. The ultimate test: when heroes become human. As we approach the 2025 to 2027 window where multiple crises could converge simultaneously, the psychological pressures on nuclear decision-makers will exceed anything that human beings have previously experienced. Unlike Arkhipov's isolated submarine decision, Petrov's false alarm assessment, or Yeltsin's rocket incident response, future leaders may face multiple simultaneous crises across different geographic regions, involving different alliance systems, operating under conditions where technological acceleration eliminates the decision-making time that previous heroes used to choose peace over war. The multiplication of crisis psychology across multiple decision-makers, multiple governments, and multiple simultaneous confrontations creates psychological dynamics that no individual heroism may be able to overcome. When Chinese leaders face Taiwan invasion decisions, Russian commanders consider NATO responses, Iranian authorities contemplate nuclear facility defense, North Korean officials evaluate escalation options, Indian and Pakistani generals plan tactical nuclear deployment, and American presidents coordinate global response. All simultaneously, the psychological pressures multiply beyond any historical precedent. The technological elimination of human decision-making time may represent the final psychological barrier to nuclear war prevention. When artificial intelligence systems, autonomous weapons, and hypersonic delivery platforms operate faster than human psychology can function, the individual heroism that saved humanity during previous crises may become impossible rather than merely improbable. In the command bunkers where these ultimate decisions await their moment, where psychological pressure will soon exceed human tolerance, where technological acceleration meets biological limitation, the final test of human nature approaches. Whether courage, wisdom, and moral restraint can triumph over fear, pressure, and instinct may determine whether our species continues or whether the psychology of doomsday finally overwhelms the heroes who have preserved us through 6 decades of nuclear peril. The human mind that created these weapons may prove unequal to controlling them when the moment of ultimate testing arrives sooner than anyone hopes and faster than anyone can prepare. Racing against Armageddon. As the psychological abyss of nuclear decision-making yawns before humanity like a chasm that swallows reason itself, a different kind of countdown begins in laboratories, diplomatic backrooms, and civil society organizations across the globe. While the weapons of tomorrow sharpen their algorithmic teeth, and the psychology of doomsday clouds the minds of those who would command them, a desperate race unfolds between the forces of destruction and the architects of survival. In the gleaming research facilities where scientists design better early warning systems, in the quiet conference rooms where former enemies engage in track 2 diplomacy, and in the public squares where citizens demand accountability from leaders who hold apocalyptic power, humanity's last hope may lie not in the heroism of individual decision-makers, but in our collective ability to build systems smarter than our fears, institutions stronger than our hatreds, and connections deeper than our differences. The question is no longer whether we can prevent World War III, but whether we can do it fast enough to matter. The Silicon Salvation, technology as peacemaker. In the sterile corridors of DARPA research facilities and the innovation labs of major technology companies, engineers and scientists work with the urgency of emergency room surgeons on projects that could transform the instruments of destruction into the tools of preservation. The same artificial intelligence that threatens to eliminate human judgment from warfare may also provide humanity's best hope for preventing the catastrophic mistakes that trigger global conflicts. Advanced AI systems designed for crisis analysis can process vast amounts of diplomatic, military, and economic data to identify escalation patterns that human decision-makers, operating under extreme stress, might miss entirely. The development of quantum-encrypted communication systems represents perhaps the most crucial technological breakthrough for preventing nuclear warfare. These systems, immune to cyber attack and impossible to intercept or manipulate, could restore the secure communication channels between nuclear powers that cyber warfare has rendered vulnerable. When Chinese hackers penetrate American telecommunications infrastructure and Russian cyber operations target NATO communications, the ability to maintain verified contact between nuclear commanders becomes a matter of species survival. Machine learning algorithms trained on historical crisis data have demonstrated remarkable capability for identifying the early warning signs of escalation that human analysts often overlook until too late. These systems can process satellite imagery, communication intercepts, social media sentiment, economic indicators, and military movement patterns to provide real-time assessment of crisis probability across multiple regions simultaneously. Unlike human intelligence analysts who may suffer from confirmation bias or information overload, AI systems can maintain objective assessment even when monitoring multiple potential conflicts simultaneously. The integration of blockchain technology into nuclear command systems could provide tamper-proof verification of launch orders while creating multiple redundant checks that prevent accidental or unauthorized weapons use. These systems would require consensus from multiple authenticated sources before authorizing nuclear weapons release, eliminating the possibility that individual psychological breakdown, cyber attack, or technical malfunction could trigger atomic warfare without genuine authorization from multiple verified authorities. Satellite-based early warning systems enhanced with AI analysis could provide the accurate threat assessment that prevented Stanislav Petrov from reporting false alarms as genuine attacks. Modern sensor technology combined with machine learning can distinguish between legitimate missile launches, satellite deployments, atmospheric phenomena, and technical malfunctions with accuracy that human operators under stress cannot achieve. The critical minutes that these systems could provide might represent the difference between restraint and retaliation when genuine crises develop. Institutional innovation. Diplomacy for the digital age. While technological solutions address the technical aspects of crisis prevention, diplomatic innovators work to create institutional frameworks adequate for managing conflicts in an age of multiple nuclear powers, compressed decision-making timelines, and hybrid warfare that traditional diplomatic institutions were never designed to address. The emergence of minilateral arrangements, smaller, more flexible diplomatic groups that can respond rapidly to developing crises, represents a promising alternative to the unwieldy multilateral institutions that have proven incapable of preventing major power conflicts. The Quad's expansion beyond traditional security cooperation to include pandemic preparedness, technology sharing, and climate cooperation demonstrates how diplomatic institutions can evolve to address the interconnected challenges that drive international conflict. While India's strategic autonomy prevents formal military alliance commitments, the framework provides mechanisms for coordination and consultation that could prove crucial during crises involving Indo-Pacific powers. Track 2 Diplomacy, unofficial dialogue between non-governmental experts and former officials, continues even during periods of official tension, providing back-channels for crisis communication when formal diplomatic relationships have broken down. These informal networks, connecting former military officers, retired diplomats, academic researchers, and business leaders, often provide the only remaining communication channels when governments refuse to engage directly with adversaries. The development of rapid response diplomatic mechanisms could provide alternatives to military escalation during the compressed timelines that modern conflicts create. Emergency diplomatic protocols that activate automatically when certain threat thresholds are crossed could ensure that peaceful options receive consideration even when military pressures favor immediate response. These systems would function similarly to nuclear command procedures, requiring multiple confirmations before diplomatic options are abandoned in favor of military action. Regional conflict prevention mechanisms tailored to specific geographic and cultural contexts show promise for addressing the local dynamics that often trigger broader conflicts. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations consensus-building procedures, despite their limitations, have prevented major military conflicts in a region with multiple territorial disputes and great power competition. Similar mechanisms adapted for other regions could provide frameworks for managing tensions before they escalate to levels requiring superpower intervention. Economic entanglement, the peace of mutual dependency. The same economic interdependence that creates vulnerabilities during conflicts also provides powerful incentives for maintaining peace, as rational economic actors recognize that the costs of warfare in an interconnected global economy far exceed any potential benefits from military victory. China's careful calibration of pressure on Taiwan demonstrates how economic relationships constrain military options even for authoritarian powers, as Beijing recognizes that destroying Taiwan's semiconductor industry would eliminate the economic prize that makes the island valuable in the first place. The massive economic costs imposed by sanctions on Russia have influenced Chinese calculations about the price of aggression, while global supply chain dependencies create stakeholders in peace across multiple nations and economic sectors. When German automotive companies depend on Chinese rare earth materials, when American technology firms rely on Taiwanese semiconductor production, when Chinese manufacturers require Japanese precision equipment, economic relationships create webs of mutual dependency that make comprehensive warfare economically suicidal for all participants. Financial system interdependence provides additional constraints on military action as global economic integration makes it impossible to wage major wars without inflicting catastrophic damage on domestic economies. The financial chaos that would result from Chinese invasion of Taiwan, Russian attacks on NATO infrastructure, or Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz would impose economic costs on aggressors that could exceed any strategic benefits from military success. Corporate diplomacy represents an underutilized resource for conflict prevention as multinational businesses possess economic interests that transcend national political objectives. Technology companies with operations across multiple countries, energy firms with international supply chains, and financial institutions with global operations all possess incentives for maintaining peaceful international relationships that sometimes exceed their home government's willingness to risk confrontation for strategic advantage. The development of economic early warning systems that track trade flows, investment patterns, supply chain disruptions, and financial market volatility could provide indicators of developing military tensions that governments attempt to conceal. Economic intelligence often provides more accurate assessment of military preparations than traditional intelligence gathering, as the economic foundations required for sustained military operations become visible in trade data, resource stockpiling, and financial transfers long before military movements become apparent. The citizen's arsenal, democracy's last defense. Public awareness and civil society pressure represent perhaps the most underappreciated tools for preventing nuclear warfare, as democratic governments remain accountable to populations that overwhelmingly oppose policies that risk human extinction. Educational campaigns about nuclear weapons effects, emergency preparedness initiatives, and democratic resilience against information warfare strengthen the social foundations required for preventing or surviving major conflicts. Grassroots organizations monitoring government nuclear policies have successfully pressured political leaders to adopt more restrained approaches to international crisis management. The nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s, anti-war protests during the Iraq invasion buildup, and current climate activism demonstrate how organized citizens can influence government policies when they understand the stakes involved and organize effectively for political action. Social media platforms, despite their vulnerabilities to manipulation and disinformation, also provide unprecedented capabilities for rapid civilian coordination during international crises. Citizens monitoring government actions, sharing information about developing tensions, and organizing political pressure for peaceful resolution can create democratic constraints on aggressive policies that authoritarian governments do not face. International civil society networks connecting peace organizations, academic institutions, religious groups, and humanitarian organizations across national boundaries provide mechanisms for citizen diplomacy that continue when official diplomatic relationships break down. These networks often provide more accurate information about public opinion in adversary nations than government intelligence agencies can obtain through technical collection methods. The development of citizen early warning networks that monitor local indicators of military preparation, infrastructure changes, and social tensions could provide grassroots intelligence about developing conflicts that supplements official government assessment. Crowdsourced intelligence gathering has proven effective in monitoring military movements, identifying disinformation campaigns, and tracking supply chain disruptions during the Ukraine conflict. Medical preparedness. Surviving the unthinkable. While prevention remains the primary objective, realistic preparation for nuclear conflict consequences represents a crucial component of crisis management that could save millions of lives while demonstrating societal resilience that reduces incentives for aggression. Modern medical understanding of radiation exposure treatment, mass casualty management, and emergency response coordination far exceeds the capabilities available during previous nuclear crises. The development of distributed medical stockpiles containing potassium iodide, radiation treatment medications, and emergency surgical supplies could provide capabilities for treating nuclear attack survivors that did not exist during the Cold War. These preparations, while acknowledging the possibility of nuclear warfare, also demonstrate societal resilience that could deter adversaries who calculate that nuclear weapons would cause sufficient civilian panic to paralyze democratic decision-making. Emergency communication systems that function during infrastructure destruction could maintain coordination between government authorities, medical personnel, and civilian populations during nuclear crisis scenarios. These systems, designed to operate independently of commercial internet and telecommunications infrastructure, would provide crucial coordination capabilities during the chaotic conditions that follow nuclear attacks. Training programs for medical personnel, emergency responders, and government officials in nuclear crisis management could provide human resources for effective response to nuclear incidents, whether they result from warfare, terrorism, or accidents. The knowledge that effective response capabilities exist could influence decision-maker psychology during crises by reducing the sense of helplessness that contributes to fatalistic escalation. The innovation imperative, breakthrough technologies. Revolutionary technological developments could fundamentally alter the strategic balance in ways that favor defense over offense, deterrence over aggression, and peace over warfare. Directed energy weapons that could intercept hypersonic missiles might restore the defensive advantages that traditional missile defense systems have lost, while quantum radar systems could eliminate the stealth advantages that modern weapons rely upon for penetrating defensive systems. Fusion energy breakthroughs that eliminate dependence on fossil fuel imports could reduce the energy weapon leverage that resource-rich authoritarian states currently possess over democratic importers. Abundant clean energy would also address the climate change pressures that create resource competition and population displacement, contributing to international tensions. Artificial intelligence systems designed specifically for peace operations rather than warfare could provide unprecedented capabilities for monitoring compliance with arms control agreements, verifying peaceful intentions during military buildups, and identifying opportunities for diplomatic breakthrough that human negotiators might miss. These systems could process vast amounts of data about international relationships to identify intervention points where relatively small diplomatic investments could prevent major conflicts. Biotechnology advances that address food security, disease prevention, and population health could eliminate some of the resource scarcity pressures that drive international competition. When agricultural productivity increases, disease burdens decrease, and human welfare improves globally, the zero-sum competition that makes warfare attractive to desperate governments could give way to positive-sum cooperation that benefits all participants. The time constraint, racing the clock. The tragic reality facing all prevention efforts is the constraint of time itself. As the 2025 to 2027 danger window approaches, faster than institutional reform, technological development, or social change can typically occur. The systems, technologies, and social changes that could prevent World War III require implementation timescales measured in years or decades, while the threats that could trigger global conflict operate on timescales measured in months or weeks. Crash programs for critical prevention technologies might achieve breakthroughs within the available timeframe if resourced and prioritized at levels comparable to the Manhattan Project or Apollo program. The challenge involves convincing democratic societies to invest massive resources in preventing disasters that may seem hypothetical until they become unavoidable reality. International cooperation on prevention efforts faces the fundamental obstacle that the nations most capable of implementing prevention measures are often the same nations whose competition creates the risks that prevention efforts are designed to address. Chinese cooperation on crisis prevention measures conflicts with Chinese strategic objectives for Taiwan conquest, while Russian participation in arms control initiatives conflicts with Russian objectives for European intimidation. The acceleration of prevention efforts requires social and political mobilization that treats nuclear warfare prevention as an existential emergency rather than long-term policy objective. The climate change movement provides a model for rapid social mobilization around existential threats, but nuclear warfare prevention lacks the sustained public attention that climate issues have achieved despite representing more immediate risks to human survival. Hope in the darkness. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the mathematical precision of current threats also provides clarity about what must be done and urgency about doing it quickly. Unlike previous eras where nuclear threats remained theoretical possibilities, current conditions create immediate practical requirements for action that may motivate the breakthrough efforts necessary for species survival. The combination of human ingenuity, technological capability, economic incentives, and democratic accountability provides tools for addressing nuclear warfare risks that exceed the resources available to previous generations. The question is not whether humanity possesses the capability to prevent World War III, but whether we possess the wisdom to deploy that capability before the window of opportunity closes forever. The race against Armageddon has begun in earnest, and the finish line approaches faster than comfort allows. In laboratories and diplomatic conferences, in citizen organizations and corporate boardrooms, in technology companies and medical institutions, the last best hope for human civilization works against deadlines that no one chose but everyone must meet. The weapons of tomorrow threaten to arrive ahead of schedule, but so might the tools of survival if we run fast enough to matter. The choice before us. As the race against Armageddon accelerates through laboratories and diplomatic corridors, through corporate boardrooms and citizen assemblies, a sobering realization crystallizes in the minds of those who understand the true dimensions of our predicament. All the technological brilliance, institutional innovation, economic incentives, and democratic mobilization in the world may prove insufficient if humanity itself cannot make the fundamental choice that lies before us. In the end, after all the weapons have been catalogued, all the flashpoints mapped, all the psychological vulnerabilities exposed, and all the prevention measures deployed, we face a decision so simple in its formulation yet so profound in its implications that it defies every sophisticated analysis we have constructed. The choice is binary, absolute, and rapidly approaching. We can choose to survive as a species, or we can choose to maintain the illusions, competitions, and hatreds that will destroy us all. There is no middle ground, no gradual transition, no compromised position between existence and extinction. The mathematics are final, the deadline is approaching, and the choice cannot be delayed. The mathematics of survival. In the sterile corridors of the Pentagon's deepest levels, where computers process threat assessments with mathematical precision, analysts have reached conclusions that would terrify any rational observer if fully understood by the public. The convergence of threats we have examined throughout this investigation creates what systems theorists call a critical state, a condition where small perturbations can trigger massive systemic failures with consequences far exceeding their initial causes. When 6 nuclear flashpoints operate simultaneously, when technological acceleration compresses decision-making timelines beyond human cognitive capacity, when economic interdependence creates cascading vulnerabilities, and when institutional safeguards fail under stress conditions, the mathematical probability of preventing global catastrophe approaches levels that no rational gambler would accept. The calculation is brutally simple yet horrifyingly comprehensive. If each of the 6 gates we have identified, Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel, Iran, North Korea, India, Pakistan, and the South China Sea, has a 95% probability of remaining peaceful in any given year, the combined probability of avoiding all conflicts simultaneously is only 74%. But this optimistic assessment assumes independence between crises that are actually interconnected through alliance systems, economic relationships, and strategic competition that could cause the opening of any single gate to trigger the catastrophic opening of all others. When we factor in the psychological pressures that cloud decision-making during extreme stress, the technological systems that eliminate human intervention opportunities, the economic vulnerabilities that transform local conflicts into global crises, and the institutional failures that eliminate diplomatic alternatives to military escalation, the mathematical models converge on a conclusion that responsible leaders dare not voice publicly, without fundamental changes in how humanity approaches international competition. Nuclear warfare becomes not merely possible but probable within the 2025 to 2027 time window we have identified. The compression of this probability into such a narrow timeframe creates urgency that exceeds any previous challenge in human history. Unlike climate change, which develops over decades, or pandemic diseases, which spread over months, nuclear warfare could transform human civilization permanently within hours of initiation. The choice we face must be made not over generations or years, but within the next 24 months, when the window of maximum danger opens and mathematical probability may become catastrophic reality. The unprecedented moment. Standing at this historical inflection point, we must acknowledge that humanity has never faced a challenge of this magnitude, complexity, and compressed timeline. Previous generations confronted wars that ravaged continents, plagues that decimated populations, and catastrophes that destroyed civilizations, but they never faced the possibility of species extinction through deliberate human action executed within timeframes that eliminate the possibility of learning from mistakes, adapting to consequences, or reversing catastrophic decisions. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which provides our closest historical parallel, involved two superpowers with established communication channels, shared understanding of nuclear consequences, and sufficient decision-making time for rational deliberation. Today's crisis involves 9 nuclear-armed nations with varying command structures, uncertain communication protocols, compressed decision-making timelines, and strategic objectives that may be fundamentally incompatible with peaceful coexistence. Unlike previous global conflicts that developed gradually through diplomatic failures and military buildups that provided opportunities for intervention and de-escalation, the convergence we now face could transition from apparent peace to global warfare within hours through mechanisms that human institutions were never designed to control. Hypersonic weapons, autonomous military systems, cyber warfare capabilities, and artificial intelligence integration into nuclear command structures create escalation pathways that operate faster than human cognition, democratic deliberation, or diplomatic intervention can function. The interconnected nature of modern civilization means that nuclear warfare would produce consequences far exceeding the direct effects of atomic weapons themselves. Global supply chain collapse, financial system breakdown, communication network destruction, and environmental catastrophe would create cascading failures that could prove more devastating than the nuclear exchanges that trigger them. We face not merely the possibility of nuclear warfare, but the potential for civilizational collapse through mechanisms that previous generations could not have imagined. The choice itself, survival or supremacy. At its core, the choice before humanity is whether we value species survival more than national supremacy, whether we prioritize collective security over competitive advantage, whether we choose cooperation over domination when the stakes reach existential levels. This choice cannot be made through clever diplomatic compromises, sophisticated technical solutions, or gradual institutional reforms. It requires fundamental decisions about what we value most when forced to choose between incompatible alternatives. For China, the choice involves Taiwan. Is reunification worth the risk of global nuclear warfare that could eliminate Chinese civilization entirely? For Russia, the choice involves Ukrainian territorial conquest versus the possibility that NATO escalation could result in Russian national destruction. For the United States, the choice involves maintaining global hegemony versus accepting multipolar competition that reduces American dominance but preserves American existence. For Israel, the choice involves preventing Iranian nuclear weapons through military action that could trigger regional nuclear warfare versus accepting Iranian atomic capabilities under international monitoring regimes. For India and Pakistan, the choice involves Kashmir territorial disputes versus the recognition that nuclear warfare over mountain territories could destroy both civilizations completely. For North Korea, the choice involves regime security through nuclear intimidation versus the integration into international systems that could provide security through cooperation rather than coercion. For Iran, the choice involves nuclear weapons development as insurance against regime change versus acceptance of international constraints that provide alternative security guarantees. These choices cannot be made through partial measures or gradual adjustments. The The mathematical progression we have outlined demonstrates that intermediate positions, maintaining current competition levels while hoping to avoid catastrophic escalation, provide probability distributions that rational actors should find unacceptable. The choice is binary: fundamental change in how nations compete, or acceptance of species extinction as the likely consequence of continuing current patterns. The failure scenario: what extinction looks like. If humanity fails to make the choices necessary for survival, the consequences will unfold with mathematical precision through pathways we have mapped throughout this investigation. The opening of any single gate could trigger cascading responses that open all others within hours, creating simultaneous nuclear conflicts across multiple continents involving all major nuclear powers. The initial exchange would likely occur between secondary nuclear powers India and Pakistan, Israel and Iran, or North Korea and South Korea, but alliance obligations, economic dependencies, and strategic calculations would rapidly draw in the major nuclear arsenals of the United States, Russia, and China. Once these arsenals engage each other directly, the escalation dynamics that produced previous world wars would unfold at technological speeds that eliminate opportunities for intervention or restraint. The direct effects would be catastrophic enough: hundreds of millions of immediate casualties, the destruction of major population centers across multiple continents, and electromagnetic pulse effects that eliminate electronic infrastructure essential for modern civilization. But the indirect consequences could prove even more devastating as global supply chains collapse, international trade ceases, and the integrated systems that support 8 billion human beings disintegrate simultaneously. Nuclear winter effects from smoke and debris injected into the atmosphere could cause global crop failures for multiple growing seasons, creating famine conditions that threaten human survival even in regions that avoid direct nuclear attack. The breakdown of medical systems, transportation networks, and communication infrastructure would eliminate the technological foundations that enable modern civilization to support current population levels. The survivors of initial nuclear exchanges would face conditions more primitive than those experienced by their ancestors before the Industrial Revolution, but without the natural environment, accumulated knowledge, or social institutions that enabled previous civilizations to develop technological capabilities gradually over centuries. Recovery, if possible at all, would require millennia rather than decades, and might never achieve the technological sophistication necessary for spacefaring civilization or protection against natural extinction risks. The success scenario: what survival requires. Success in avoiding this catastrophic future requires choices that may seem impossible until we recognize that the alternative is species extinction. Nations must choose cooperation over competition when vital interests conflict, accept limitations on sovereignty when national actions threaten global survival, and subordinate short-term advantages to long-term species preservation. Concretely, this means China accepting Taiwan's de facto independence rather than risking global warfare for territorial reunification. It means Russia accepting Ukrainian sovereignty rather than pursuing imperial restoration through nuclear intimidation. It means the United States accepting multipolar competition rather than maintaining global hegemony through military dominance. It means Israel accepting Iranian nuclear capabilities under international monitoring rather than eliminating them through military action that triggers regional nuclear warfare. It means India and Pakistan resolving Kashmir disputes through international arbitration rather than nuclear confrontation. It means North Korea accepting security guarantees from international institutions rather than regime protection through nuclear weapons. These choices require political leaders to explain to domestic constituencies why national humiliation is preferable to national extinction, why accepting less than optimal outcomes serves national interests better than pursuing maximum objectives through military means. Democratic societies must support leaders who choose restraint over retaliation, compromise over victory, survival over supremacy. The success scenario also requires unprecedented international cooperation in developing the technological, institutional, and economic systems necessary for managing global competition without resort to warfare. This means crash programs for defensive technologies, massive investments in diplomatic institutions, and economic integration deep enough to make warfare economically suicidal for all participants. The individual choice within the collective. While the choices facing nations seem to require decisions by political leaders, military commanders, and diplomatic institutions, The ultimate choice belongs to individual human beings who must demand that their governments prioritize species survival over national competition. Democratic societies possess the political mechanisms for imposing these choices on reluctant leaders, but only if citizens understand the stakes involved and organize effectively for political change. The choice facing individuals is whether to remain passive observers of political processes that could determine human extinction, or to become active participants demanding that survival take priority over all other political objectives. This means supporting political leaders who choose restraint over retaliation, opposing military spending that increases rather than decreases warfare risks, and demanding diplomatic solutions even when they require accepting less than optimal outcomes. For citizens of nuclear-armed states, the choice involves recognizing that national nuclear weapons provide security only if they are never used, and that the political conditions necessary for ensuring they are never used require international cooperation that may conflict with nationalist political preferences. The mathematics are clear. In a world where multiple nuclear powers face simultaneous crises, everyone's security depends on everyone else's restraint. The individual choice also involves psychological preparation for the compromises, humiliations, and frustrations that survival may require. Human psychology prefers clear victories over ambiguous survival, decisive action over patient restraint, national glory over species preservation. Choosing survival requires individuals to override the evolutionary psychology that values tribal success over collective preservation. The weight of history. Those who understand the true dimensions of our predicament carry a terrible burden. The knowledge that we may be living through the most important moment in human history, when decisions made by fallible human beings under extreme pressure could determine whether our species continues to exist or joins the countless others that have vanished from Earth's surface. The weight of this knowledge creates responsibilities that no previous generation has faced. Future historians, if they exist, will examine our choices during this crucial period with the same scrutiny that we apply to the decisions that triggered previous world wars, ended previous civilizations, or prevented previous catastrophes. They will ask why we did or did not make the choices necessary for survival when the consequences of failure were so clearly understood and the mathematical probabilities so precisely calculated. The tragedy would not be that we lacked the knowledge, technology, or institutions necessary for preventing global catastrophe, but that we possessed all the tools necessary for species survival and chose not to use them because the political costs of survival seemed higher than the risks of extinction. Future generations would struggle to understand how rational beings could choose competition over cooperation when the stakes reached the level of species survival. Yet there is also unprecedented opportunity in this moment of maximum danger. If humanity can make the choices necessary for surviving the 2025 to 2027 crisis window, we will have demonstrated capabilities for global cooperation, rational decision-making under extreme pressure, and collective action for species preservation that could serve as foundations for addressing other existential challenges including climate change, asteroid impacts, and technological risks that await in humanity's future. The final hour. As we conclude this investigation into humanity's date with destiny, the inescapable conclusion emerges that time has nearly run out for the luxury of gradual change, compromise solutions, and political expediency. The mathematical precision of converging threats, the technological acceleration of warfare capabilities, and the institutional breakdown of crisis prevention mechanisms create conditions where only immediate, fundamental choices about human priorities can preserve the possibility of human civilization continuing beyond the next decade. The choice cannot be delegated to political leaders, military commanders, or diplomatic institutions, because all of these depend ultimately on the support and demands of ordinary citizens who must decide whether species survival deserves priority over every other political objective. In democratic societies, this choice belongs to voters who can demand leaders who choose survival over supremacy. In authoritarian societies, this choice belongs to populations who can create political pressures for restraint rather than escalation. The clock that began ticking in underground bunkers continues its countdown toward midnight, but unlike previous doomsday clocks that measured abstract nuclear risks, this countdown measures concrete preparations for conflicts that could commence within months rather than years. The six gates tremble on the edge of opening. The weapons of tomorrow sharpen their algorithmic teeth, and the psychology of doomsday clouds the minds of those who command them. Yet in the laboratories where prevention technologies develop, in the diplomatic conferences where former enemies seek common ground, In the citizen organizations that demand accountability from nuclear-armed governments, humanity's better angels work against deadlines that no one chose but everyone must meet. The race against Armageddon has become a race against time itself, and the finish line approaches faster than comfort allows. The choice before us is simple in its formulation. We can choose to survive as a species, or we can choose to maintain the competitions that will destroy us all. We can choose cooperation over domination, restraint over retaliation, survival over supremacy. We can choose life over death for 8 billion human beings and all the generations that could follow if we prove wise enough to continue. The mathematics are final, the deadline is approaching, and the choice cannot be delayed. In the command bunkers where ultimate decisions await their moment, in the hearts of leaders who hold apocalyptic power, in the minds of citizens who can demand better choices, the future of human civilization hangs in the balance. Time is running out, the window is closing, and the choice is ours. What will we choose?